First on our agenda is a review of our meeting minutes from May 17th. I'm sorry. Yeah, May 17th. Sure. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the meeting minutes, not the agenda. From July. Sorry about that.
The only thing you saw last, at the top and bottom of the very first page, motion carried something to something. Usually 40-0, 5, whatever it is.
We'll fill that in there.
Yeah, I think, as I recall, it was unanimous, but,
Yeah.
based on what Dan said, I'll move to approve the July 19, 2023 minutes as presented.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Everybody. Roll call. Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Next up on our agenda is a continuing review of the updated zoning ordinance. This evening, we're going to talk about Article 5, with the regulations applicable to all districts. And with that, I'll open it up, I guess, to Kevin to see if you had any intro, and then we'll turn it over to Elisa.
No, I don't have any intro tonight. I'll turn it right over.
Can y'all hear me? Yes. Okay. As usual, if something happens, just start waving at me. Good evening. I am Elisa Duffy Rogers with CT Consultants. With me this evening is Frank Tweehus, who is also with CT, and thank you so much for having us here. Tonight, we will quickly run through the zoning ordinance update process. We will review 5 draft zoning ordinance chapters. All of these sections are in the zoning ordinance article entitled Regulations Applicable to All Districts, and then we will end with next steps. As usual, I will stop during the presentation to answer questions and hear from community members. The zoning ordinance update is progressing in roughly 4 phases. The first phase included an analysis of the existing conditions, as well as a thorough examination of the existing zoning and subdivision ordinance. And at the end of this phase, we produced a diagnostic report, which included findings and recommendations, and that's currently available on the city's website. Phase 2, which is the phase we are currently in, includes revising the existing regulations and providing major changes for your current code, and those are being fleshed out at this time. In phase 3, we will complete all of the amendments, align the zoning map with any new zoning districts, and we anticipate starting phase 3 in January. And then phase 4 is adoption. We have added additional opportunities for community members to discuss proposed changes and ask questions. On Thursdays after the Planning Commission meeting, we hold coffees and conversations at Fort Thomas Coffee from 10 to 11:45 a.m. and from 6 to 8 p.m. Please feel free to drop in anytime during those hours. At the Planning Commission meeting the following month, I report out what I heard at those meetings. At the sessions in July, approximately 7 community members attended, and we discussed the adequacy of the existing lighting regulations, especially when parking lots abut residential neighborhoods. We also went over the draft text and map for the Central Business District and the sub-districts for Midway and Town Center, which is what downtown is called, as well as the draft text and map for the Traditional Business District, which is the new district for Inverness. Community members also expressed concerns regarding putting the VA hospital in the CBD Midway District, and attendees discussed at length changing the sub-district that encompasses 2 through 24 South Fort Thomas, which is US Bank, Guardian Bank, and Post Office, and community members asked that those be placed in the supporting sub-district rather than the core. As I mentioned earlier, all the sections we will be discussing tonight are in the zoning ordinance article entitled Regulations Applicable to All Districts. We will start with section 5.0 that explains how to handle unique situations in the administration of the zoning ordinance. And most of this section was imported directly from your existing zoning regulations with only minor changes. The only new subsection incorporates performance standards, which are the standards that govern objectionable impacts from land uses. Today, the zoning ordinance indirectly includes performance standards, and we added explicit standards for all the internal impacts that you see on the screen, which include noise, vibration, smoke, odors, and such things. Many of these negative uses are also covered by the city's nuisance regulations. Section 5.1, this new section pulls together the accessory and temporary use regulations that are currently scattered throughout the zoning ordinance. We will talk about a few provisions, but many of the existing regulations are basically unchanged. We did add standards for outdoor dining and outdoor storage and the sale, outdoor storage and outdoor sales, as well as standards for accessory dwelling units. The zoning ordinance currently has standards for home occupations. These include no outside employees, only people residing in the home may be a part of the home occupation. The square footage of the home devoted to the home occupation is limited. The exterior of the home may not be altered. Outside storage is prohibited, and accessory structures may not be used for the home occupation. It is also not permissible to sell goods directly from the house, and all sales have to be limited to online sales. In addition to that, traffic and deliveries are limited, and no external impacts from the home occupation are permitted, and there can be no increase in home utilities resulting from the home occupation. So a couple of questions. So these standards have been in place, as I understand it, for a number of years. And so, do you think they need updating? In particular, should they be allowed to have an employee from home occupation? Should you be allowed to use your accessory structures from occupation? So we'll start our discussion tonight.
So, traditionally, like Elisa said, the home occupation regulations, she kind of put them in there as they were. We don't see any major issues with those. Obviously, if you have an employee, maybe you're taking a parking spot, is that a big deal to you all? Maybe not. Accessory structures, we traditionally haven't been able to use those for any level of storage. Not really sure the rationale there. It may have been that they didn't want somebody to bring their lawn equipment if they're a lawn service and park it there or whatnot. But those are probably two of the things that Elisa mentioned that people will ask for once in a while. But in all honesty, there's not a true demand for it, nor have we had really any issue. So the question is do you want to modify that in any way with allowing employees, allowing exterior storage, or any other things outside of that?
I guess one question I had, and I guess this is almost more of a city policy question, is do you want to make reference in this ordinance that any home occupation would be required to get an occupational license and pay city payroll tax?
So they are required to get a home occupational license. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how the payroll tax side of it. That's out of my.
I mean, and do you include remote employees in this definition?
Say that last one again?
If you're a remote employee, you're working for your employer, but you work out of your house. But you work for your employers somewhere.
Gotcha.
This was never contemplated to be used in that context. But it's a policy question, should remote employees be considered a home occupation? If they're fully, working out of their house 24, not 24/7, but, during the work week, if they're fully working out of their house, is that considered a home occupation? As such, do they need an occupational license? And as such, do they pay city payroll tax? And then all these other provisions also apply.
That might be more of a council type.
That's what I'm saying. So that's a question. I think that's a legitimate question for council, because I know there's a lot of other municipalities wrestling with that same issue. I know the APA is also looking at guidance on a national level for that kind of a situation, since it's pretty much been around there for about 2 years. So it's something I think, at least it's worth some discussion.
Yeah, I'll pass that one on to the city administrator to get the field council.
Because in my opinion, the rest of the terms in this section, I don't necessarily have any problem with. It's just, do you expand it to include the remote employees?
I think we should, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So what you're saying is remote employees then would have to get an occupational license even though it's not their business?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be an occupation, well, hypothetically, the business, it wouldn't be them necessarily, it would be
Well, that's
their
what-
employer.
Yeah, that's what I know.
Correct.
Yeah, because
Correct.
typically that's who gets the occupational
Correct.
license is the company, not the employee.
Correct.
Yeah.
May I just interject? I know in New York City, for example, my daughter-in-law works at Morgan Stanley in New York, but lives in Cincinnati, and she pays taxes to New York because she's working remotely, but that is the parent. So I think that's probably a legal analysis, Tim.
Well, so, I just did, on that same note, basically, if you're in the city of Cincinnati and you don't physically work in the city, you're not required to pay any tax to the city of Cincinnati. So the same would apply presumably with New York. If you don't physically work there, you don't pay New York tax. So that's based on the Ohio Revised Code and the Kentucky Revised Statutes.
When I worked for a company in Ohio, and I worked from my home here, I paid all of the Ohio.
Right, so like on days when I work in Fort Thomas, which is occasionally, and then it's probably gonna be more so moving forward, I'm actually gonna take my withholding from Cincinnati and transfer it to the city of Fort Thomas.
Doesn't, just as an aside, pre-COVID, work at home was not a common thing. Now,
Exactly,
80% of the people
Right.
don't think will ever go back to an office.
right.
So that seems more than a one-night sort of.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
I
He's
mean,
supposed to meet with Matt Friday, and I think these are great topics. I'll bring it up with him and Joe as well, because I know I pay taxes in all the different counties I work in the different municipalities, so I'll bring it up. I think that's something that needs to be dealt with.
So there's a couple of issues here. I think we should definitely reference that they need to get the occupational license, just because it needs to be out there for people to see, if they're the standards. So that we'll definitely add. Whether or not the home occupation is considered, a remote worker is considered a home occupation definitionally is a separate issue
Correct.
than whether or not they pay taxes.
Correct.
So then I would turn that to you. I mean, in many places, if you're a remote worker, you are not required to get a home occupation permit because you do not in and of itself run a business out of your home. But that is a policy choice that you could add such that you could then enforce all of these other requirements. But that is a separate issue then, where they pay taxes.
Correct.
So I'll return to you and say, do you think someone who works from their home 3 days a week should have to abide by the standards I just went through?
that's not a planning and zoning decision, is it?
That's what I was just thinking.
Well, like in my, so we have employees that work out of their house, that are surveying, construction inspectors, they get deliveries to their house, because they work remotely now. I mean, it's basically everything that's on this screen that they do out of their house. They work all the time out of their house. They get deliveries, they get FedEx deliveries for the company at their house.
That does make a difference.
I think you have to be more clear on the definition of home occupation.
Yeah.
Right, you will have
Because
to change.
that is really the key.
Right, you would have to change the
Yeah.
definition
Right.
to include remote workers, which is not a
Yeah.
typical thing
That's
for
correct.
most places to do
Right.
from the standpoint of the zoning ordinance. How they pay taxes and where they pay taxes and all of that.
But I'm just saying in terms of, traffic generation, I mean, some of our remote employees actually have people that work for them at their house.
And so,
So-
as you said, some of them get deliveries and some of them
That's
have.
totally different than somebody who from COVID, the office said, work from home.
Well, that's what these people are. They're working from home, but they're not working for themselves. They're working for a company.
Right,
Out of
and-
their house.
And the reason that home occupation became a thing and became a defined term within zoning ordinances is because of the impacts associated with it. And so that's what Dave is saying, is that the impacts from this home occupation, from a remote work, could be very similar to the ones that come from a home occupation in terms of the intensity, like you said, people are coming to their house and reporting to them. They're getting deliveries, they're having their work vehicles stored at their home with, the name of the business there. All of those things look, smell, and act from an impact standpoint,
It's the same way.
like a home occupation. So,
I did that for 30 years, exactly what you're saying. Out of my house, I had their company car in the driveway. but they were based out of New York. I paid taxes, but I was never told to get a license or anything. That to me is something new.
And this would be, right, but again, how you pay taxes is a separate issue. So my question to you is, are you worried enough about remote workers that you would define home occupations differently to include them?
I would define it too.
Yes, okay.
I wouldn't know if I would define it differently than any of the, all the provisions I would be the same.
No, when I mean the actual definition.
Yeah, I
would have to be-
would include remote work as a home occupation.
But if you work remotely and you never once had anything delivered to your house, never once had an appointment held at your house, never once had a client come to your house, how can I be a business, huh?
Well, you could be one of these people, work for yourself and don't have deliveries and don't have clients here.
So what you guys are saying is if you're a home, if you're working from home, these now apply to you.
Correct.
The physical, you're talking about
The physical.
the physical stuff. You're not
Correct.
talking about anything else.
Well, I mean, the taxes are another
And
issue.
an occupational license.
Pardon?
Yeah, I mean, the
Some
occupational
taxes and an
license.
occupational license. And I don't know how you could regulate that.
Well, we
That would
could.
be well, I don't know how you can enforce it.
Yes.
And there are many places who, while they have these standards, do not have a permit per se, because the impacts from them are almost non-existent. And these are only in place if they get a complaint.
Yes.
But you being the city of Fort Myers, you actually have supposedly, this occupational permit that someone is supposed to get. I would bet you, my bank account, that most people who have this, who run a business out of their home don't have this occupational permit, based on 30 years of doing this work. They only get it if they get caught. So, but that's a whole separate issue. The question before you is, do we change the definition of home occupation to include remote workers? That's one issue. Then we can which will then apply all of those standards, and then we can separately say, if you actually have a home occupation in the traditional sense, whether you're a limited liability corporation or whatever else, you then also have to get the occupational license. That would maybe be a way to make this work.
That's essentially what
Okay. I'm gonna draft it that way.
I mean, from a physical sense, whether you're working for yourself or working for somebody else, what difference does it really make? You're still potentially having the same impact. I mean, you don't want somebody working for some company and, maybe there's some utility worker and they get material delivered to their house on a regular basis. I had a neighbor when I was growing up, he worked for General Electric, he'd get appliance parts delivered to his house every day. And you go out and do repairs to whatever, But he wasn't working for himself.
If companies are saying that we're allowing our employees to work remotely from their homes, there's no way on this earth I can move forward on it that I couldn't do it. I mean, if I work for a company and now I'm limiting parking and I've got to apply for an occupational license because I work for a company.
But that's what we're saying, you wouldn't have to get the occupational license if you're a remote worker.
But hypothetically, it would still, and this is a separate thing, but hypothetically, it would pay criminal tax.
But that's a separate issue. I'm not gonna worry about, that's a huge issue, and certainly Tim they'll have that conversation.
That's for Joe and that.
Right. And we're not saying that if you work remotely, you can't do it. And we're not even saying you have to get an occupational license. We're just saying you have to meet these standards. You can't have more than the normal amount of deliveries. You can't have an employee report to your house. You can't do any of those things if you're a remote worker.
Could we revisit the employees' situation? I know Kevin said he never had an issue really, but I do know a case in Cold Spring, an engineer had like a dozen employees, and it got to be such a problem in his neighborhood that he ended up moving, getting a bigger house. They were still working out of the house, but he had space for a dozen cars and all that. The fact that we don't address it kind of leaves us wide open to have something like that happen here.
Well, right now, the standards say you can't have anyone that doesn't reside in the home working in home occupation. Some places ordinances post-COVID are now allowing 1 or 2 employees. So that's why I raised that issue. That's a fairly common way that people are changing their ordinances post-COVID. But if you don't want to allow outside employees, that's certainly your prerogative. You just keep what you have. All right, let's
Do
keep
we
it.
have anything definitionally about, if you have an employee come and pick things up at your home or whatever else? Is there anything with a regular appearance or a regular work site, or, I'm just wondering if we defined anything about the employee that comes there?
Not currently.
Okay.
Do you think we need to?
Well, I don't know.
I mean, I think what's up there is generally okay. I mean, it says if there's a commercial delivery bigger than a regular van, limited 1 delivery a week, I mean, that seems reasonable. And, there's no traffic generated in greater volumes that would normally be generated in a residential neighborhood. I mean, well, that's more for a residential zone,
But I think Tim's question is, how do you define employee, right? I mean, the person may not show up and work 8 to 5, but they might show up and pick up stuff or
company
whatever
or
else.
whatever, yeah.
In which case then we would just have to fall under the traffic generation and all of that. So I would think we would leave it the way we have it unless you have some demonstrated need to further define what it means to be an employee.
I think we have is there something there that prevents you from meeting with clients?
Yes,
So we've got all of that then.
we've got all of that.
The only other thing I would say is like in the 3rd bullet point there where you have about shall not produce heat, sound, vibration, glare, dust, odor, blah, blah, blah. You define you kind of cover all those things in the other section about the environmental impacts and performance standards.
Right.
Maybe it would be better just to reference that section, shall not, produce any emissions in accordance with sections, whatever. Since you cover those in more detail.
All right, I'll do that. And that's pretty much your existing language, but I can do that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some stuff in the environmental part that needs to be taken care of too, but at least you can reference it that way.
Yep, I'll do that. All right. Anything else on home ops?
Could we go back to lighting for a second? We just had a comment about lighting at One Highland, and do we have a process? I mean, we have photometric plans and specs on lighting fixtures and stuff. Do we have a process to confirm that stuff was built in accordance with the approved plans?
So I'm meeting with somebody tonight. When you see me leave, I'm meeting with somebody to do some light meter readings and try to figure out some of those details, and get to the bottom of it. Over there at One Highland, the poles were put up, we put some shields up, we tried to put a different light up, we turned them off temporarily. And, our ordinance really doesn't say anything about a minimum lighting requirement, but that's kind of where I want to get to. I've got a professional over there that I'm going to meet that wanted to try to get to the bottom of that to determine what we need to do next. It feels like with the bollard lights out there, there's quite a bit of light provided for that parking lot. However, I want to make sure that there's enough for the restaurant that's coming in, that they can get to the dumpster and things of that nature, but and not project onto the adjoining properties. I think the issue, I think, is the fact that Woodland sits down so much lower, and I don't know how that survey took that into account. So I'm going to try to get to the bottom of it. We've been dabbling with this for a while, and I haven't pressed terribly hard because the urgency wasn't there for additional lighting out there, and because partially the bollard lights do provide quite a bit of light. So that is something that we're going to push a little harder since we're getting closer to the restaurant opening, and get an answer on that particular light.
But our ordinance doesn't specify that those things have to be checked and met before a certificate.
So the photometric it talks about the photometric survey, and honestly, I kind of relied on the professionals on that one in my review. We've got a professional survey here. I kind of relied on that, to be quite honest. as far as checking it, I didn't go through the process of getting our engineers involved to check all the ins and outs of that. I was kind of relying on that.
Yeah, I'm not being critical of the
No,
job, I'm just saying, should there be a process in the ordinance to confirm that the plans do conform with what was in the built plan, the as-built condition, relates to the approval?
Absolutely, and I think it's probably there. I think it was one of those that, you know, I don't know if I want to call it an oversight or not. I think it's something that, you know, I didn't have somebody else review it. I relied on that.
And Jerry, we will get to more discussion about the lighting later on.
Oh, okay, I thought that was on
Oh,
purpose.
no problem. We will talk a little bit more about it. So today, air conditioning units, meaning those outside units, must be set back 5 feet from side lot lines. Many existing lots are so narrow that it's very difficult to meet this requirement. And so we have discussed previously reducing that to 3 feet, so it would be a 3-foot setback from the lot line with the outside air conditioning condensers. And I just wanted to confirm again that we were okay with that reduction.
I question that. I mean, if you can't get within 5 feet, it seems like the condenser should be in the backyard instead of the side yard. And I've witnessed a number of neighborhood complaints about people that like to have the windows open in the summertime, and all they hear is the neighbor's condenser kicking on, or compressor kicking on and off. I think 5 feet, really, I think it should be 10 feet, you know.
I think some of the rationale behind it was the technology that we were getting moving forward is much better, and the units are so much more quiet, et cetera, and I think that was part of the rationale, but also the fact that we already have a non-compliant, in many cases, a non-conforming house, and then you have this setback that we were considering getting down to 5 feet without the Board of Adjustment, that you have this in that vicinity. So I think that those are 2 bits of rationale for considering it, but you know,
Could we put a decimal level or something in there so you have something that you can actually check instead of just saying sound shielded and screened? You know, I know neighbors that just really have problems with that.
Mhm.
You know, reducing it doesn't seem like a good.
I agree with Jerry that if it's that close, it should be moved to the back, especially with the lots we have. Like you said, we have a lot of offset lots that have 2 feet on one side and 12 feet on another side. And then somebody buys the lot next to them, tears it down, and gets variances and builds even closer, so they're probably 6 feet from the house, and then put the air conditioner.
so the AC unit is, we had an issue with it not a few years back at Board of Adjustment. Actually, if there's a dimension assigned to it, they could conceivably go and ask for a dimensional variance. And that happened in one particular case, and I think they're much more sensitive to it now, and actually with any variance that they pass, they're asking the question about that. It is important to them. But, you know, if you feel that strongly about it, I think we can bump it back to the 5 feet if that, or more.
I mean, I wasn't sure, do we require them to be in the back now, or is it allowable on a side yard?
No, it's allowed, that's the exact language that you have today. The only change I've made is reducing it from 5 feet to 3. So that's what the standard is right now. You can't meet the 5 feet, you either go to the backyard or you go to the Board of Adjustment.
Well, no, I wouldn't say you go to Board of Adjustments, because they're gonna give you anybody the variance anyways. I would say you would have to stay.
They're not gonna give anybody a variance anyway. They're critical of those units. They ask it at every meeting, when there's an addition, possibility of an additional, additional units in any way. And if there's a dimension assigned to it, they can ask for a variance. Per KRS, they can ask for that, unless we reword it in some way, but I think if you assign a number to it, they can ask for a variance.
Yeah, that's required by the
So
KRS.
somebody come in and say, you want 3 feet.
We have to allow, if there's a dimensional standard given within the zoning ordinance, by law, we have to allow that to be appealed to the Board of Adjustment. We
So
have-
the only way to change that would be to require it in the rear yard.
The only way to change that would be to require it in the rear yard, yes. You know, keep in mind that when you make that choice, there may be situations in older homes or whatever else, that it's going to be difficult given where the furnace is and various other things in the house, to put it in the back. So I would hesitate to tie someone's hands. I think we can leave it at 5 feet, but to just, say it has to be in the rear yard and no ability to grant a variance may be difficult for some homeowners.
So can you change the new buildings that it has? So, is that existing?
And what's the rationale for that?
I'm from Michigan, they're all in the backyard, so I don't know why they're in the side yard here.
So I've got a comment. I don't know how many generators are in town, if you guys have any ideas, but I know along the East Coast, there's a lot of people getting generators just because of blackouts and stuff like that, and they're really loud. And surprisingly, my mom is getting one, and they're letting her put it in her side yard, and it's very close to her neighbor, so I don't know if there's any kind of rule here
I
about
think
that.
that would fall under this.
Yeah.
It's outside the camp.
Yeah, it's outside mechanical equipment, and that would fall under this rule, that it could be in the side yard, has a setback of 5 feet. In terms of impacts, a modern air conditioner condenser is quiet. The generator, in and of itself, because it has to test every month,
Right.
at least, is much louder.
Right.
So we could differentiate between generators and condensers. I would not have any hesitation of requiring the generator to be in the backyard, but I do have a hesitation about the condensers.
I do too. Some of these houses are so old, and where their furnace is, there's no way, mine could never be in the back. There's no way it could be, the way the house is set up.
I would say
The generator, I don't mind on the side because they're emergency things.
Yes, but they
They're
do.
not there forever.
No, but they do run once a month.
But they
Well,
install
yeah.
permanent ones, Sam.
They install permanent ones that run, they have to test every month. And I happen to be standing in front of my neighbors when it tested last week. And it's fairly loud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it a 15-minute thing? I don't know.
Oh, I don't remember how.
You
Or
can, you can
term.
set the time. You can determine, like, my mom is gonna set hers for noon.
Yeah, I mean, you determine the time, it has to be once a month, but how long it actually runs, I don't know, to be honest with you.
I think you can set that too. Ours runs for 15 minutes.
Yeah, so it's
Every
15
Tuesday
minutes, yeah,
morning.
yeah. So it's not a huge, you can do it in the middle of the day and it's not a huge period of time.
With our requirement here, I guess I'm in favor of keeping it at 5 feet.
Yeah.
Could we require the shielding in that regardless if it's on the side? So that if it's on the side, even if it's more than 5 feet from the property line, if it's on the side of the house, it still has to have some kind of sound shielding, whether it be a fence or shrubs or
Yes.
whatever.
Yes.
I guess the only thing is, how do you judge what's effective? You put flowers out around it, do you think?
Well, I think we've got here equal in distance, or equal in height to the height of the appliance at least, so I'm just, that might be an incentive to put it in the backyard. You don't have to do that.
When there's not much space between the houses, it would be very awkward to put a fence there. There's only between my house and the house next door, maybe 8 feet.
Well, I mean,
But then you wanna
You're
put
still-
a fence there, and then we have to mow it?
It is difficult because there's a number of situations where houses are very close together and they want to put them on the sides. Both neighbors maybe are in agreement, let's stick them on the sides, have a relatively small area there so we can entertain in our backyard. I had an issue similar to that I was gonna make them put it in the back and they really didn't want it there. I think they moved it to the other side of the house because that's where they entertain. So it's not exclusive, it's very difficult because some folks don't care that they're right against the property line because there's no windows, there's really not much going on between those two houses that they like there. So, like I said, it's not an easy answer, but,
well, if you still have the requirement regardless of the distance on the side, I assume you could get a variance on that as well. So if you could.
No, you cannot in Kentucky. If it's a number, you can get a variance, but if you are going to require
Require shielding.
the shielding, they really can't get a variance from that.
I'm not so sure how well the shielding works. I got
Yeah.
it.
That's what I was thinking,
Even though I'm
acoustically, I don't.
25 feet from the next guy or whatever, nothing, just because I wanted it covered up and make it look better.
Right.
But if you were on the second floor,
That's what I was thinking.
or
or on my deck,
Mm-hmm.
it's not doing much for me, it's the sound's coming up. Because I'm only building it as 5 feet high.
Right.
What about
So that's
consideration for the
shielding the
space
whole
for like emergency? Like if there's a fire, if you got units on the side, are you allowing enough space for, say, fire department to get through?
So the way the ordinance is currently structured, you can have a small setback on one side and you have to have a larger on the other, which would allow for emergency access if necessary. But you already have many situations where you have homes that are sitting, you know, foot off the lot line on one side and 3 feet off the lot line on the other side. That's just your existing built environment. We are not necessarily permitting that under the new ordinance, but that is the case already. All right, so we're gonna keep 5 feet, I'm hearing that.
Yeah.
And what do we want to do about Tim's suggestion of requiring sound deadening, whether it's 5 feet or 10 feet off the line?
I guess I would change that if you can't get a variance for that, then I think I would be inclined not to include that, other than if it's that close. So if it is within 5 feet, then you need it.
All right, so basically, we're gonna keep the existing language as it is. All right,
Yes.
all right. Please don't feel bad that we just spent 15 minutes talking about that.
Compelling.
I've spent hours talking about, and in meetings talking about where you can store recreational vehicles.
Those are usually the best solutions. Off that a while.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So during phase one, we discussed accessory dwelling units at length. And accessory dwelling units are self-contained, smaller, secondary dwelling units located on the same lot as the larger principal dwelling that contains a living and bedroom space, a kitchen, and a bathroom. They can be internal, such as in a converted attic, or they can be separate and in detached structures, or they can be attached to the home. In past years, accessory dwelling units were often called granny flats or in-law suites. This illustration shows the various ways that an accessory dwelling unit may be accommodated on a lot with a principal dwelling. The upper left graphic shows a detached unit. Next to that is an attached ADU. And all the other graphics showed ADU that is attached to the principal dwelling or in converted space, such as in the attic or the basement, or attached to, or above an attached garage. When we talked during phase one, detached ADUs were not desired. Instead, we talked about integrated accessory dwelling units, and that those seemed more acceptable during that time. And those would be things that are either attached to the house in some way, or interior to the house, like I said, in basements or attics or upper floors. As the ADU regulations are currently written, integrated ADUs would be permitted by right in all of the R1 districts as well as in the R2 district, which is the two-family residential district. The draft language includes, states that you could only have an ADU if the lot is conforming. So if the lot is too narrow or too small, you couldn't have an ADU. That detached ADUs are prohibited. That integrated ADUs must comply with the principal building setbacks unless a building is non-conforming, in which case it would be permitted. Only one ADU would be allowed, and the size is limited to 40% of the area of the principal dwelling or 1,000 square feet, whichever is less. There are additional design standards for the ADU as well. You can't have exterior stairs on the front of the home. If you have an addition to accommodate the ADU, it must look like and be compatible with the existing house. The location and design of exterior doors for the ADU must be located and designed in a manner typical for a single-family home. And any additions to the house to include the ADU cannot exceed the height of the existing home. Also, the ADU and the principal dwelling must share a driveway, meaning you can't have two separate ones. And an additional parking space would be required for the accessory dwelling unit unless it's waived by the planning commission. And then also short-term rentals would be permitted in the ADU.
So I just had a question about the parking space. Do we require a minimum amount of parking spaces for a single family unit?
You do. Yeah, you do. You do. As I said, you know, ADUs would be permitted by right in the R1 districts as it's currently drafted. And so my questions to you are, should they be permitted by right in the R1 districts and the R2? Should they be conditionally permitted? Should we vary whether it's conditionally or permitted by right by zoning district? Should you allow detached ADUs? If so, in what zoning district? And if so, by right or conditionally? If you have a non-conforming lot, one that's too small or too narrow, should they be allowed to have an ADU? Is the floor area restriction that I've mentioned appropriate? Are there any other appearance standards that need to be added? And do we want to require parking? It's a lot of questions.
What's the difference between a two-family and a single-family with an ADU?
So a two-family, the units would be the same size. They'd be equivalent. An ADU, by the very nature of it and how it's defined, it has to be smaller. 40%, for example.
So you're basically taking a single-family zoning area and allowing that now to become a two-family?
Not directly, no. Because you cannot have two dwelling units that are the same size. You would be allowed to have, as I said, what's traditionally been called a granny flat.
So you could have like a bedroom and a kitchenette attached to that, an additional bedroom and kitchenette attached to the house.
Or one in your basement.
Or one
Or work.
Would you, could it have separate utilities or not? Because to me, that, when you have separate utilities, then that becomes the two-family.
If we want, we can say no separate utilities.
Is this the, are any of you familiar, I believe it's on Lilac, that is a new, looks, is it Lilac? I don't think it's Azalea, it's one of the ones off of Newman. Pardon me? The Party Garage? No, it just keeps sort of like growing. I thought they were just building a rooftop over the garage to have patio, tiki bar. But now it looks like more. I've not studied it, but I just go up Newman now and again.
I issued a permit for it. It's just a garage with an entertainment area there. The gentleman at the time did talk about potentially connecting the two, making an addition, but it is a single family.
I wasn't asking that, I just was curious if that was an ADU.
What are the regulations now? Like if I want to put an in-house suite in my house right now?
Exactly.
Do I have to, is there regulation? It's not regulated at all right now.
You cannot do it right now.
Oh, really? So you couldn't, that, little in-law suite in, that's interesting.
I think there's some houses that have them.
Yes, I think there are some that are older in the house that have them. And then more than likely, some have been illegally converted. If nothing else, it's a bedroom and a microwave or
Right.
whatever else.
Yeah. Or a bar, wet bar.
A wet bar, a microwave,
Microwave.
or a convection, countertop convection oven, or
Correct.
whatever else.
Yes.
But you cannot legally have an accessory dwelling unit today. That doesn't mean they don't exist because they existed in 1920, or because they've been
Yeah.
illegally converted.
So if you were remodeling your basement and put a bedroom and a kitchenette in there with your wet bar, that's right now prohibited?
Correct.
People already do that. That's not, that's a whole bit. Right. I know, that's what.
So there's a difference between, right now, I believe in our zoning code, we define that only a family can live in a house, say a single family. So we could do ADUs as it's still part of that single family, but what you're proposing, or someone's proposing, is to allow this to be rented as an Airbnb, short-term rental.
So that is a policy question. Should it be allowed for short-term rentals? It doesn't have to be.
Or is it long-term rentals? Right now, it would have to be the family, it would be your mother or your father or your sister. But if we're talking about actually renting it to an outsider that's not part of the family unit in a single-family residential areas.
So keep in mind that we cannot, under zoning, regulate whether or not something is rented to someone who lives in that, who is related to the house, the people who live there or not. We don't have that authority. All we have the authority to do is say typically, and I don't remember what your definitions of family is off the top of my head, but it is typically people who are related by marriage or adoption and two unrelated. Is that what it is? I think it is.
I think so.
So
Yeah.
right now,
3 or 4 unrelated.
is that what it is right now?
Because it says family, blood family, and then, or adopted,
3, I think was said.
and I think it says 3.
3? Okay. So right now, you could, for example, if you had a 4-bedroom house, rent it to three of those bedrooms to people who aren't related to you. And that would be permitted, because that's how we define the definition of family.
But you don't need bathrooms for these unrelated people.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
But you don't need bathrooms for these unrelated people who are renting?
They would have to have a bathroom in the house in order to be a legal
Well,
dwelling.
I know one, but not,
Individually, no.
But no, you wouldn't have to have a bathroom designated for each individual bedroom, no.
wow. But you do for the ADU rentals.
For it to be a ADU, it has to have a kitchenette and a bathroom to be classified as an ADU.
Three persons.
Yep.
If it's
Three people.
detached, do they have to pay taxes on it as a separate building?
I didn't hear you, I'm sorry.
Oh, it can't be detached? I thought that was an option.
So is our question whether we want to
Let's
just
just
allow
start-
them, I guess we all acknowledge that people have them right now, and so do we want to allow them by right in an R1 district? Is that?
Correct, so when we just had the discussion during phase one, we talked about allowing them by right in the R1 and R2 districts if they were integrated. There was a very long discussion about whether or not the detached ones were permitted, should be permitted, and y'all decided that you did not want to do that. So for example, you couldn't convert your detached garage into an ADU. So the primary question is, A, do you want to allow them, yes or no? And if you don't, if you do, then how do we allow them? So let's start with those two questions. So
I don't think we want people building another house behind their house.
we're not allowing that.
Okay.
Because they can't, as it's currently drafted, they can't be detached.
Well, attachment, we got one down here in Bluegrass that grew into that. And we have the one on Memorial, is that, I don't know what you call that, on Memorial there, Clover Ridge comes down.
Yeah.
You got the house in the front, and you got the mother house in the back.
No, I'm not sure.
Oh, I've been
You know what I mean?
seeing
Right there where the
Memorial
light
Parkway.
goes
I
right.
know where you're at, but I'm not
I don't think they're attached at all, I think there's a driveway between them, like,
I thought there was a connection, you drove under the
maybe
connection.
a walk under thing, but that's about it.
Right.
It's a walk.
But we don't want that, right? We don't want that
Well,
size of thing, we
Yeah, I
want
think-
smaller thing.
Well, that's the challenge with zoning in your, there's some folks that will maximize a lot,
Well, yeah.
every part of that lot, and, kind of, you can argue overbuild a lot, but if it meets the setbacks, it meets the setbacks, and, they can put a big addition on. The issues that, one of the issues with that I actually have talked to Frank at one point about, and we need to revisit, is drainage. And when you add that much impervious area to a lot, you're taking away the ability for water to leach out and get away, but that's a separate issue. But I think the idea is, I personally don't think that they should be detached. I think if they're attached, you have a mother-in-law suite or a basement like that, it seems reasonable, but, where do you all feel, and obviously, how does that compare to a short-term rental? We obviously permitted the short-term rentals, as, less than half a year or something like that? I think we had some certain parameters on the short-term rentals when we approved those. So it couldn't be a short-term rental in and of itself. It would have to be a part of that, like renting out a basement or a room or something.
So
I think if people see the most, maybe it's just the physical size. Okay, if you're in a room on the, or
Well,
a
physical
back of your
size,
house after 10 years in the neighborhood.
well, what if somebody just wants to add it for the room, not necessarily for an extra suite, I've got 6 kids and I need more space. I mean, that's the challenge of distinguishing the two.
Yeah, but it wouldn't grow like down here. It wouldn't be that big, that's a separate house, you know that.
Well, I think so. I think the consensus is we don't want detached.
Yeah.
That's correct. But you
But
should be
we're
able-
willing to permit.
But then it's.
Well, and you should be able to remodel your basement. If you have a basement that is a concrete floor and you want to put a family room in there with a wet bar, bedroom and bathroom, that is called an ADU, correct?
If you have cooking facilities.
Well, I said a wet bar.
Yeah, but to me, a wet bar is just the same.
Well, with a microwave, because you Probably.
Again, a microwave would not be classified. It
Okay.
would have to be something that you know, gas or you plug into 220.
But a lot of people do that to your basement, when you put a family room in, you put a bedroom and a bathroom, so that is an ADU. So, as of right now, you're saying no one in Fort Thomas is allowed to do that?
If they have hardwired cooking facilities,
Correct.
they would not be allowed to do that.
Correct.
That would not prevent them from having the microwave and the
That's
convection
correct.
oven that sits on the.
Right,
house.
but there, it is everywhere.
Yeah.
Yes, everywhere you would not be
Right,
allowed
so,
to have
correct.
essentially a dwelling unit in your basement if it has.
Correct. That's correct. So, I don't think we should, I think we should allow it. It's already there. You're remodeling your basement. All your
The
equipment.
only problem with that is the size, if you
Well,
build
that's.
a totally
Yes.
size structure equal to the one you already got.
Well,
That's-
that's what she's prohibiting, it's going to be 40% of that.
Yeah, or maybe less than that.
Or whichever is less.
How- What type of,
It's 40% of the dwelling unit or 1,000 square feet, whichever is less.
And Lisa, what did you mention about a separate, couldn't have a separate driveway?
Correct.
What about separate entrance?
You can have a separate entrance. but
Just
it-
not in the front.
I'm sorry, what was that?
You can have a separate entrance, but it must look like an entrance to your home as opposed to something that was added on at the last minute.
And it can't be in the front.
And you cannot have stairs in the front, and you cannot have a front entrance, unless your house already had one, which some of your colonial Dutches do,
Yes.
have 2 front doors. My house, oddly enough, has 3 front doors. Don't ask me why.
Here's houses like
Um,
that. Here and there.
Well, a lot of the houses in Fort Thomas had the mother suite, and that's why there are
Yeah.
2 factors.
Right.
There were some on Linden, there's
Yes.
some, yes.
On
so-
Highland Avenue.
Yes.
Or Fort Thomas.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some of your homes already do have a front door.
It's-
So if your regulation says if you have one,
Yeah.
you can keep it and use it for your ADU, but you cannot put a new one there.
It is a very traditional housing setup. I mean, it's historical, it's traditional. I mean,
Yes.
And
So if you build it-
I think it can maybe set off a couple of alerts to say, and you can rent it. You can have it as an Airbnb, that to me is running another business. because
Well, you can do
have-
that now
they
in
have a
any of your houses.
We can.
Yes.
We can rent our rooms out to anybody.
Yes, you can either rent your whole structure, or you can have short-term rentals that was passed, what, in 2018?
That's crazy.
2019.
That's probably what needs to be reviewed.
Why is that
So if
allowed?
you're allowing short-term rentals, I got the short-term rental ordinance.
I don't mean to interrupt, but we are kind of dragging down. We do have a period of time. I like the conversation and the communication, but we're really getting bogged down. If you could reserve any comments for when we do.
Okay,
Bring
I
this
just
up.
had a question.
Thank you very much.
All right, so we want to allow,
attached to 40% sounds, they were going, right?
Yeah,
it would have to be attached to 40% or 1,000 square feet, whichever is
Yeah.
less.
that's what you.
If you don't put that kitchenette in, I mean, we don't have a restriction on how big an addition can be as long as it conforms to setback and everything
Correct.
else, correct?
Correct.
So you have 1,000 square foot house for addition, another 1,000 square foot, and it didn't have any cooking.
As long as you can meet
Then
setback.
why would you do move somebody in later?
I didn't hear you,
Why
sorry.
would you do move somebody in later, like 10 years later, you gotta move somebody in there, that you put something in there?
So if they illegally put in cooking equipment, that's a different issue. But
No, I'm
that's,
saying, it was just a straight addition before, and then you need to use some of that for somebody to move into, and you put a stove in there.
then you would have to come in and get a building permit in order to get that stove theoretically. And then Kevin would say, and Mark would say, you can't do it as it's currently drafted, as it's your current ordinance is. You could not convert that in and of itself to a separate dwelling unit. That was the same size as the existing unit, unless you were in R2, in which case, because then you could have a duplex. All right, so.
The only thing I'm not so sold on is the parking. I mean, I don't know, I mean, I understand potentially you could need parking, especially, and for the short-term rentals, I think we did require a parking space. But if it's a family member, and especially if it's an elderly person or maybe a young person, are they driving an additional car that wouldn't already be there anyway? I doubt it. I don't know that there's a compelling need to require an additional parking space beyond what would already be required for the residential
Right.
unit.
And you do actually require parking for your short-term rental, I'm looking
Right.
at right now. So many communities go both ways. some people feel like, you know, like what Dave says, this is my mother-in-law, she's not driving. Other people feel like, you know, potentially your mother-in-law's gonna die at some point, and,
True.
and, you know, and then you might wanna, you know, rent it out, or your teenage child may move in there, or whatever else, in which case you need a car. So the parking in and of itself is a policy choice. You can require it, or you cannot.
I mean, I'm just thinking, if you have to share a common driveway with the house, whoever owns the house is gonna make up their mind, do I want another car in my driveway or not? You know, it's.
Where do you put that space? Yeah, parking space would be allowed, it's just another car back up in the driveway, they have to have separate exit. And the way our town is laid out, the topography, I mean, it's just about impossible to get another parking space.
Right.
Yeah.
So no parking required. All right, got it.
And we are allowing it in R1, by right.
Yeah, by right,
Yeah.
by right in R1, everywhere. And you're okay with the floor area limitation, you like the appearance standards, and we're prohibiting detachments.
What about the, no separate utilities?
Yes,
What do you want to do about separate utilities?
I think prohibited.
Okay,
I do too.
I think that further kind of reiterates that it's a single,
Right,
it's just single house.
correct.
With just this ADU for your in-law or something along those lines.
And if you do end up renting it out, then you have to deal with the electricity usage.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, I'll add that standard. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So integrated and rooftop solar energy systems are permitted as accessory structures under certain conditions. An integrated solar energy system is one that is incorporated into the building materials like roofing or siding, and it's indistinguishable from the building material itself. And so that's what you see in that top picture. They're now creating roof tiles that are solar panels. So that's an integrated one. The rooftop solar system is what you see in the lower picture that you see down there, which is the panel that's installed on top of the roof shingles. So right now, the rooftop solar can't exceed the maximum height permitted in the district by more than 5 feet, and they can't extend beyond the ridge they have for the eave, and they're not allowed on the front of the structure. They are allowed on the front of the structure if they are mounted at the same angle as the roof structure, and there's no more than 18 inches between the roof and the upper side of the solar panel.
Lisa, where would there be a 5-foot-high solar panel? Or is that other lighting?
So
It
in
said
some,
it can't exceed 5 feet above the.
right, so you're limited by where your house is and where the trees are, where the sun is, and all these other things. And so in some cases, it'll look like that. So the panel is here and the roof is here. And so the panel's slanted. And so at that point, it could potentially be up to 5 feet.
Are we allowed to have them match the roof, the color, in the front, anyway?
You could add that as a requirement, that it be the same color as the roof, but I think that might be tricky if you have a
Okay.
brown roof or
Yeah,
whatever
I
else.
don't
I think
know
that would be tough to do.
There's nothing other than black
Right.
solar
Yeah.
panels right now, are
So
there?
I
Right,
don't
that's
know.
all I know
Yes.
about.
I don't know, that's why I didn't know, because,
And so,
Yeah.
Black or gray.
Compatible with, how's that, fuzzy word.
well,
Well,
again,
then how do you make it,
how do you-
enforce it if it's
Well,
fuzzy?
it's better than a red one on a
That's true.
black roof, you know.
yeah, that's what I was,
That's all you don't want.
you don't know what color's gonna come out
Leave
in
them
a
be
year, 2,
compatible.
3.
Well, you can't prohibit somebody from having a red roof or multicolored roof today.
No.
No, you can't prohibit, all I said is make it match existing. So if there is a red roof, I guess you have to have a red solar panel.
Right. Or you could have, but there's no requirement to have, you could have half a red roof and half a blue roof if you want.
Correct.
Yeah.
There's no requirement to say if you put
Right,
it.
but I just said match
Yeah,
existing.
the metal.
Didn't say
metal
limit the
roof.
color, just match existing.
Yeah.
There.
Well, all I'm saying is like, we're not requiring, like if somebody had half a house with brown shingles, and they wanna put green shingles next to it, they don't have to match.
Isn't that what we're doing, things like that? I mean,
Huh?
If we can just hold comments, guys, until we get to that whole, that's
I mean, I don't have a problem with it the way it's written.
and we don't allow separate systems that aren't on the roof, do we? We don't, that'd be an accessory structure. We don't allow that to put it on the fence line or.
Solar array in the backyard type thing.
So in order for you to have a ground-mounted one, it would be considered an accessory structure, and have to meet the accessory structure standards. We have not contemplated, we meaning I, have not contemplated it being erected on a fence, and I can't imagine,
I don't know if you'd have to prefer a square.
I just don't think that would work. Put it on a fence.
I just know in some places, I mean, they've got a whole line of them along a property line.
Right.
You know, mounted, so they're not on the house and whatever else. If we've got the accessory structure restriction, and that would be considered an accessory structure, I think we're probably fine.
It would. Any concerns with regulations as I've mentioned?
I think this is one of those things, when people start getting the rebates going for the Inflation Reduction Act, things actually start coming out over the next 5 to 10 years, I think it's probably something to revisit down the line
Could be.
as it becomes more common, depending on how issues crop up, so.
Right. And we don't know the technology's gonna be 10 years.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, it was Pam who mentioned to us that there was a roof in town where the whole thing was shingled with panels.
It actually looks very nice, so, and it's on the front and the side.
Right. All right, well, at this point, stop and take community comments on the general use regulations and the temporary and accessory use structure regulations.
Is this our time to ask questions?
About those topics, general use and the general use regulations and the temporary and accessory use
So
and
we're
structure.
talking about the short-term rentals. Well, did you agree to allow short-term rentals? Or did we not discuss that yet? Let me just say my question. We have a short-term rental ordinance in Fort Thomas.
Yep,
If we allow short-term rentals in the granny flats, that will be subject to the ordinances that regulate short-term rentals in general, is that correct?
correct.
Yeah, it
And
doesn't
one
matter
of
what
those
the truck
regulations is that they provide a parking spot for that short-term rental. So
Correct.
I just want to be sure that that's, did you, just for clarification, did you agree to allow short-term rentals in the granny flats?
Yeah,
We don't prohibit it.
Okay.
but it's the same for any structure, basically.
But when you say you don't need an extra parking spot?
You do if it's a short-term rental.
Right, but I thought that when they were talking about renting out your, whatever.
So you would need it because it's subject to the other ordinance. You would need parking.
But you
Yeah.
wouldn't if it was a family member, or you wouldn't rent it.
Oh, you didn't rent it.
Correct.
Like if your mother-in-law.
Understood. Okay.
Any other community comments about what we've already discussed?
I do have one comment. When we talked about the air conditioners in the side yard, one of my neighbors, it just was an issue, which they did it perfectly, but there were two different considerations there. One was the sound shielding, and the other was the decorative component of trees or a structure. And I think that kind of, at least what I was hearing, maybe got a little bit messed up. So I think you all decided not to require either one, right? Neither the sound shield nor the decorative,
No, we kept it simple.
We kept if it's within 5 feet of the side property line, then it does require the shielding, the sound shielding,
What
not
about
a
the
decorative. I don't think we
fencing
have any
and/or the,
decorative requirement.
Go ahead.
how about the fencing and or the trees? What did you decide about that?
To the height of, I think the.
This just said as it's shielded is what it said.
Yeah.
But I think
But
the
it does
way
say
it
to
was
the height
worded
of
up there
the
was,
appliance, I think.
Height of
the way that was worded up there was that you would have the sound shield and the decorative component. Those are two different things, the way it was worded on your thing. So I
Yes,
guess
it's currently, the current language is, you can get 5 feet if they are sound shielded and screened with fencing and or shrubs equal to the height of the appliance.
So they need both the sound shield as well as the decorative element.
Correct.
Okay.
As it's currently drafted today in your ordinance and will be remained based on this conversation that we had.
Thank you.
All right, moving on. So section 5.2 pulls together your existing regulations for your hillside development controls and your tree conservation and restoration requirements into a new chapter that is the environmental regulation section. Other than adding an intent subsection and updating references, the regulations are essentially unchanged.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
I'll comment in a minute.
Okay. The purpose statement for these standards is to establish development standards to protect the functions and values of the environmentally sensitive nature of the area, to protect valuable and unique and fragile elements of the environment by maintaining and preserving biodiversity, and to preserve and enhance the natural beauty of landscapes and open ridges. So that is the only thing that is truly new to this section. The hillside development controls were imported, as I said, from your existing regulations. And in terms of what is applicable, if a site has two or more of the characteristics that you see on the screen, then they are, and the proposed development is subject to the hillside development controls in addition to all of the other standards that are in the zoning ordinance. And the illustration that you see on the screen is from a comprehensive plan, and it shows in the city in green areas where you have slopes greater than 20%, since that is the first standard to determine whether or not something is applicable. In terms of the hillside development controls, sites have to submit plans indicating the existing topography and proposed physical changes, as well as erosion and sediment control measures, the areas to be cleared, and any other changes to the site. They also have to submit a geotechnical report and a tree survey for any trees over 8 inches. And the plans also have to show all the trees that are being conserved on the site and all replacement trees. When the planning commission reviews all the plans subject to hillside development controls, the commission has a set of guidelines to use when evaluating the plans. These guidelines include that you can't leave cliff-like vertical slopes. You have to utilize small parking areas rather than large ones. Buildings have to be planned to fit into the existing hillside rather than altering the hillside to fit the buildings. And any modifications to the earth have to be replanted in compliance with the landscape standards that we will discuss in just a moment. The evaluation guidelines also state that the building should take advantage of views, the existing views without obstructing the views of other buildings. And they should also avoid rooftop utilities and screening control and sound control if rooftop utilities are used. And proposed site changes should respect the site's steepness and soils to ensure hillside stability during and after construction. The evaluation guidelines also state that the scale of new buildings should match the terrain and that the parking should be on the uphill side of the development and should be behind the buildings in order to preserve views. That natural site features such as streams, wildlife habitat, plants, and trees should also be respected. And finally, techniques should be used that create a variety of architectural solutions to the issues and are responsive to the limits and potentials of hillside development. So a lot of guidelines for you to consider when you're looking at plans that are for sites that are subject to these standards. So my questions for you are, do you have any concerns with your existing hillside control measures? And my understanding is that you haven't had a whole lot of developments that were applicable for these standards, but if you have any, the ones that you remember, have any issues surfaced?
And these are applicable, whether it's a residential or a commercial or any,
As long as it
it has
had
a 20%
two
slope
of
or
those
something, yeah.
factors, then yes, it's applicable. So
So-
it's a site issue versus a use or district issue.
So I just had a couple comments. I mean, I think in general, they're pretty good. I actually wrote some of that in pre-considerations. I guess the one question I had, and this is more of a kind of a regulatory question, is when we developed this initially, it was I think in 04 maybe, or I can't remember exactly when we developed this chapter, but in any case, should this be considered an overlay district or not?
So it really should.
Because it's kind of an oddball thing.
Right, it doesn't exist, an overlay district sits on top of an existing physical location of land.
Right.
And so we don't know where all of these potentially areas are. I mean, we could map it in certain areas and make it an
I
overlay.
mean, we had mapped, at one point, we had done some GIS analysis of where the 20% slopes were all in the city, and we had done that at one point.
And that was on that map, where I
Right,
showed you that.
Right,
in
but
the
we
map.
didn't we didn't regulate it as such. And I guess that's my question, is just from a regulatory standpoint, does it need to be in a overlay district to be enforced? Is there any kind of legal issue with it, the enforcement of it, since it's kind of, it's defined physically, but not geographically?
Because Dave, in the past, when I was on planning, we had one that, I can't remember exactly where it was, but I'm trying to remember how it got to us. I think it was through staff that it was in 23, it was a hillside area.
Right.
And so, is that how that gets to?
I would say so. I wonder, if we do have some mapping in place that determines that, perhaps we could add it as more of a resource to the developer than anything, make it easier on your planner if they were to pull that out of there. I don't know.
The existing regulations do state to look at the comprehensive plan to see if your site is on slopes 20% or greater. So it is
Is
there.
comprehensive plan really define that? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so that, this map is from the comp plan, sorry.
Yeah, but does that delineate it by like parcel? I don't know.
No, it just delineates it in general. We could create a map that better maps it, and include it in the ordinance so that at least it is more known. You have to have two factors at least, but that is obviously the most important one.
Development plans are supposed to have a topographic,
They
they're
do.
supposed to show,
They
so
do.
could we also add in that section that they actually show where the slopes are greater than 20%?
Existing.
Wouldn't that song?
Sure.
Maybe.
Instead of just having a topographic map to make topography and delineate any slopes greater than 20% on the development plan.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great idea. We can add it here, and then we'll also add it in the plan section, in the development review section, so that if someone's actually looking at the ordinance, they're notified in two separate places that that needs to be shown in the development plan.
And how does that happen now, Kevin or Mark? I mean, if somebody comes in, you tell them that this is applicable to whatever
Yeah, I mean,
property?
generically, obviously, we haven't had any major development plans on hillside slopes. Whenever we get a individual residential unit, most of the vacant lots that we have in the city, virtually all, they're not built on because they're on a 20% slope. So the question usually, when they ask, it's usually, you're probably gonna need a geotech, without just generically, you're probably gonna need a geotech because that's a steep, when we look it up on the map there, it's pretty steep back.
Right,
So
so that's one
it's-
reason why we put that in there, was to kind of make people think about it.
Right.
Well, that's what happened at Rio Grande, right? All that dirt, major movement of dirt.
So-
And we had
Bill Brown?
plenty of down Chesapeake.
Yeah, Bill, yeah, that's a little corny, so.
Plenty of, technical people that
Yeah.
didn't hillside at all.
Yeah, absolutely. When, the few houses that I inspected, actually, I did have a geotech there, and they were, most of them were actually on solid rock up there. So there was a few of them that, as you get down to the cul-de-sacs,
Yeah, we kept them off of that.
but either way, we were involving.
They were, I don't remember anybody complaining about house slipping or any of that. In Fort Thomas.
I mean, I think we have some hillside slope issues. As far as those
Structure, maybe.
adversely affecting the structure, not necessarily directly, but yards, absolutely,
yards.
slipping and things of that nature, absolutely.
Like I said, my main concern to make sure it was enforceable, and it was clear definition of what its applicability was. that's
Is
all.
20% kind of the number, I mean, it's been a long time to develop, that's kind of the number that a lot of people use, right?
More or less.
Whether it's 25 or 30 or.
Is that 20% in any slope on the parcel?
Existing.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, is that, the parcel itself is 20% over the whole?
Well,
Or if you've got a cliff in your
If
area?
there are slopes more than
The area they
20%
want to do
more.
something with.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to, the whole parcel could be,
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, where I live, my backyard goes out
Right,
quite
so
a
your
ways, and
house-
then it goes
yeah,
straight
so your
down.
house
So
would have been-
I'm sure I've got a 20% slope.
Yeah, so
on
when they developed,
2% of my
the
lot.
extension there on, Walden, that came under this. Yeah.
I mean, the standard, I mean, you're asking a very good question, which is, in terms of applicability, is there anything there that would give someone any wiggle room to not have to comply? That's essentially the question.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of namby-pamby in it, to be honest, you know, because it says things like, the hillsides provided view of a major stream. Well, I mean, what does that mean, right? The rest of them are a little more definitive. I think at the very least, we should provide a map in the ordinance itself. We should put the references in the development plan review section and add a requirement for topographical delineation of anything with 20% or more.
Well, I think I thought in the development review control, even on the site plan requirement, we're required just that topographic.
We
map.
do, but I think Jerry's comment was to have them call it out directly. Is that right, Jerry?
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
I guess I misunderstood.
Right.
Plus, the building code allows the inspectors to require technical, people to come in if they see something doesn't look right. So, I actually reading these regulations, was surprised to see it had to be 2 conditions. All the time I've been doing this for 25 years, if I saw 20% slope or more, I'm like, boom, geotech. I'm not messing with it. I don't want the hillside, you know, it's a big issue in this area. I'm not getting part of that, so, I think everybody generally knows when they get into these hillsides, 20% or more, they're gonna get a geotech, whether it meets the rest of those requirements or not. So, for the individual ones, I always look at that for the individual, especially with, coming to Fort Thomas, it's more infill, than I was used to, but I'm looking at that, cause like Kevin said, empty lots, they're empty for a reason.
Yeah.
So my question to you was, I mean, I wasn't here when you developed it. Why did you choose 2 or more?
Because I think there was a variety of conditions, I mean, I think we added in the 20% slope, because I don't think that was in the original draft of that. I think we just had it was more of, initially, I think it was more of an aesthetic, like, we don't want people blocking our views kind of a thing, and then we backed it up to make it more geological. And so we added in the cope and the 20%, and some of that other stuff was in the geotechnical investigation requirement. I added some of that stuff in there at one point. So. And like I said at the time, and again, we haven't had huge amounts of development, but that was kind of the reason for this. We want to make sure that there wasn't rampant, uncontrolled development on the hillsides. And so, and we had, the Hillside Trust came in and they offered some draft review of this too at the time. So.
Or people developing below existing stuff and causing the whole hill to move.
Right. I mean, I think generally it's been okay. I mean, I don't have any major concerns. I just want to make sure there wasn't any kind of like regulatory loophole where people said, oh, I didn't know about that. You know, how does that fit in the context of the, you know, KRS 100 to the KRS 82? You know?
I mean, I'm almost tempted. I mean, is there any stomach for just getting rid of everything that's not definitive and just saying you have slopes of 20% or greater, you were applicable? Do you have any concerns on that?
Because that's pretty much what happened in the past anyway, right?
I didn't hear
I
that.
think that's pretty much what happened in the past anyway.
I mean, I think that is gonna be the most legally enforceable.
Okay with that, yeah.
All right, let's do it.
We're gonna keep the code.
Yeah, I will keep the code.
We'll keep the code.
Okay.
So is it an and/or? Is it, they have to apply both?
I think it would be an and/or.
number one or number two, what pops into play now?
Then you have to provide all the things we already talked about, which was the geotechnical report, and then gives them an opportunity to review it, given the guidelines.
And the guidelines as far as trying to fit the hillside and not, all those elements that were in there. Let's go back a slide. All those elements about fitting the structure to the hillside, putting the parking on the upstream or the upslope
Okay.
side,
So all we're changing is actually making it more restrictive. So more sites,
Or
would
more,
potentially-
more defined.
more defined, potentially. So more sites would be defined to have to apply. They have this all be applied to them.
Are we protecting the people that own the land next to something like this, like down on Memorial Park, when they put the big apartment thing in there? I know people up on the hill were always worried about, because there was some slippage over time that they knew about. That if they built that apartments in there, they'd have even more hillside slippage up above. And take their backyards with them.
Well, this ordinance
So
doesn't.
how do we
currently
protect
draft
the
it.
adjacent?
Now, did that site have slopes between percent or more when it was developed in the apartment?
Well, I think what Dan's getting at is
In the building.
development, where the development wasn't, but above it was. So if you cut the total slope, then we're concerned about slipping above.
This thing's slipping down, so we.
So it wasn't strictly the 20% where the development itself was, it was the hillsides above that could have been affected by that development. And that's kind of where it got into the providing views or functioning as community separators. That's kind of where that subjective kind of language came in there. And I think you have a point.
Yes, how do you prove that you're not affecting the budding property owner by doing this? If you go down to Route 8, you do something on the big hill, is Collinsworth House gonna slip down the hill?
That's really the lawsuit's coming.
What's that?
Spoken like a true lawyer.
Send you to Tim.
I mean, that's a separate policy issue, right? I mean,
That, what I would do is if you're touching any part of the 20%, whether you're at the top or the bottom, you're potentially creating a situation, because you could be in this case, the apartments down here affecting people above, or you could be doing something on top affecting people below. You have to do the proper engineering to make sure you're not affecting that hillside. So if they built those apartments down here and never touched that hillside, that's one thing, but once they started, hit it once with a bulldozer blade or whatever, they gotta do something to stabilize that hillside so it's not gonna go anywhere, because it does affect the neighbors, so, which is what the whole hillside trust is about, is doing all this work to keep the hillsides where they're at, and not down in the river.
I don't think they had a problem down there.
Well, they were mostly filling that cutting. They did cut it out a little bit.
But yeah, once you veer into that 20% or the cope stuff, you start affecting that, you're gonna have to get some engineering in there and make sure that hillside's not gonna be slipping at all.
But even the engineering doesn't agree, like Columbia Parkway,
Mark,
One
you have
group's gonna be
guidance
different than another.
in the existing statutes, or, how far away from that 20% slope you are or whatever before you're actually affecting it?
There's actually some parts of the building code that talks about, how far away from the toe or from the crest of the hill you gotta be, or how deep you gotta go with a footer.
Are those sufficient, what they've got in there, or do we need to add something here for the, that would give added strength to that, if you're not on a 20% slope, but you could affect it?
Well, the nice thing about the building code is it's the authority having jurisdiction can make up, having to bring in a technical advisor if we feel uncomfortable, so, and there's not much argument to it. As long as, I can't make them do it along North Fort Thomas right here, because anybody can see it's flat. But where they're gonna be developed anywhere on the hillsides, most developers are gonna be ready to go with the geotech already. And that's not gonna be a surprise to them. And homeowners, I actually have one lot now, I've had several people interested in, it's got a pretty good slope on it, and I've already told them they're gonna need to get geotech in to get the foundation out of the ground.
Lisa, do we just put something simple, stupid up there, language? The purpose of all this is really to keep the budding property unaffected.
well, protect the people who are doing it
Protect
on
the
their
people
own,
that are-
as well as.
Yeah, even though
others.
they'll tell them, just kind of a warning thing that, hey, do your diligent work.
Well, and I mean, that's part of the development plan review, that's all we're talking
Well, I'm
about.
just saying that the uneducated guy slipping when he presented doesn't mean much, but if you put a paragraph up there and said, the reason we're doing all this is to,
Like a preamble.
preamble, yeah, kind of thing.
Well,
Fort Thomas is built on a lot of.
It has it, isn't it?
It does, all right, so
Yeah.
the existing preamble says, the purpose of this subsection is to
Right.
promote the public health, safety, and general welfare, and to minimize public and private losses resulting from earth movement, erosion, deforestation, and related environmental damage in the areas subject to the hillside development controls, as well as adjoining properties.
Right.
So we
I
have-
think we did cover
I
it.
think that's,
Yeah.
all right, trees. Like the hillside control measures, existing tree conservation and restoration requirements were imported into this draft with only minor changes to update terms and zoning districts. These regulations work in concert with the requirements in Chapter 98 of the General Code of Ordinances. Chapter 98, if you don't remember, establishes a tree commission and requires, except under limited circumstances, that 40% or more of the aggregate diameter inches of identified native trees on the property be retained on the site. The tree conservation and restoration requirements as applicable are now going to be applicable to major subdivisions and development plans that are reviewed by the planning commission. Right now, the current draft says subdivision plans. So if someone is splitting their lot in two, that's technically a subdivision plan, but that does not make them applicable to the conservation district. So it would be a major subdivision, which means any time that you're adding public infrastructure, would be defined as a major subdivision. As you know, the city has a tree commission, as we just talked about, and in this particular situation, they provide a recommendation to the planning commission, and the planning commission has the final authority to approve or deny a plan that is subject to the tree conservation and restoration requirements. The following requirements apply for all major subdivisions and development plans in any zoning district. There has to be a tree inventory plan that is in compliance with Chapter 98 of the General Code of Ordinances. Protective tree barriers have to be provided around all conserved trees. Utilities, grading, access drives, and other similar site improvements should only be placed between the tree protected zones. Construction activities such as material storage and concrete washout areas are not permitted within the tree protection zones, and a landscape plan has to depict the number and location of trees to be planted. In addition to the other landscaping requirements that we will talk about in a little while, additional trees have to be planted based on the zoning district according to this chapter. And for example, in the multifamily districts, there has to be one tree planted for every unit approved. Notice that's approved, not built. As I mentioned, these regulations work in concert with the requirements in Chapter 98. Do you have any concerns with the existing regulations? Are there any modifications that you want?
Really quickly, Elisa, just for my own clarity, are you defining major subdivision? Sounds like you are, with infrastructure. I think, and I haven't run into this, there's not a lot of, we don't get a lot of these requests, but is that straying from our current language? I think our current language says any plot of land that's being divided, there's more than 3 lots divided since 1966, has to get a development plan. When you go through the development plan process, it would seem to me that they would have to comply with the tree regulations at that point.
So keep in mind that development plans and subdivision plans are separate and distinct animals under KRS. And you don't currently define major subdivision, you only define subdivision in the way that you just said. So what we're saying is anytime there is a major subdivision and we intend to define that as the installation of new infrastructure, whether that's utilities or streets, would then be required to do this, as opposed to a subdivision plan that could potentially just be something quite minor and should not necessarily be applicable for this.
I'm just thinking of the instance where somebody wants to divide a lot into 3 lots that does not need infrastructure. Would they need to develop, I think they would still need a development plan, and would the tree regulations still apply?
They would not need a development plan, they would need a subdivision plan.
Right.
And as this is currently drafted, no, they would not. Which is a policy choice.
I mean, if you're dividing a lot into 3 parcels, but they're not building any infrastructure other than maybe a driveway.
I mean, I think, you know, at what point obviously we're a tree city USA, we wanna save our trees, and I'm just thinking of a situation where somebody wants to divide a lot, maybe they have enough frontage or, and whatnot, to create 3 or more lots, but don't need any infrastructure. I think those trees should still be protected.
Yes.
Go through the process of inventory and that was the whole
Yeah,
thing with
absolutely. If it's
trees.
more than 3 lots, period. I think that's the way I've interpreted it up to this point, if I'm not interpreting
If
it
it's
correctly.
more than 3 lots, or if it's 3 lots?
3 lots or more.
3 lots or more.
If they have a parcel, they're subdividing into 3 lots or more, I've interpreted it as, they need to get a development plan. And if they get a development plan, and maybe I'm misusing the terminology subdivision versus development plan, I apologize. But
I
at,
get
at that point, they have to do a tree study. And I believe I'm interpreting it correctly. I don't know if you all have any other.
Well, right now it says all subdivision plans,
Okay.
and I changed it to major subdivisions. We can, because the clarification of,
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, to me, it seems like the tree inventory itself would be really, well, it seems like it would be predicated on having a development plan. Cause you could split the 3 lots and leave it be natural for the rest of the time. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing anything to the trees. So would you have the inventory though?
You know, build on it, then you need to do it.
Yeah, but
Well, I
if
think
you're
it's part of
actually
your
building.
development plan. If you.
Well, that's what I'm saying, the difference between a development plan and a subdivision plan, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, I just wanna make sure we're protecting the trees if they're, and make sure I'm not missing a
but keep in mind, so let's just say you divide a piece of land into 4 lots, and you're going to build 4 homes on it. There will never, ever be a development plan that comes before this board. There will be a subdivision plat that comes before you, but there will not be a development plan, because single-family homes do not require a development plan.
Unless there's a road being built to provide
Unless
access
there's a
to that
road,
road.
That
in
would
which
be a
case,
development plan.
in which case it will not be a development
Well, it
plan.
might be.
Terms are not important, I'm sorry. Then it would have to come here in terms of construction plans.
Is that the way our language is currently written?
What?
In a manner that if 4 lots were divided, they would not have to get a development plan?
Correct. If it's going to
I may
have
have been
4,
misinterpreting that then.
if it's going to have 4 single-family homes on it.
Right.
If it's going to have multifamily, then yes.
No, I'm saying 40%, I may have.
As long as it doesn't include a street.
As long as it's a clear street.
I understand, and I see where you're at, and I may have been misinterpreting that. And not that it comes up a lot, but I have had an instance or 2 where someone has requested to split their lot into 3 lots, all residential single-family homes with no public improvement, and I have said you need to get a development plan. So I may have been misinterpreting our language.
There may be some conflicting language with the subdivision regs.
I'm sorry.
There may be some conflicting language with their subdivision regs.
Your current subdivision regulations are not very good, and we will be talking about that next month.
Well, I wonder if that's where I'm getting getting hung up. I don't know.
Well,
So I apologize.
So let's-
relative to trees, if we build anything, we really want them to do
So
the
that-
inventory thing as a minimum.
Well, if you're building a house, do you have to do a tree inventory?
Well, we should, yeah, I think if it's a landmark tree, you're gonna take it down, and once again, I think we allow the landmark tree to be taken down as long as you do other planting someplace else.
Well, the flip side is you go out today, you can tear down every tree on your property.
You can officially, I think.
There's no regulation preventing you.
It's an education thing, right, Kevin, for the.
Well, if you're
tree,
gonna require somebody
we
to do an
educate them
inventory.
How important they are and everything else, but you own it, so you can really do your own thing with it. If you pay the penalty and plant someplace else, either in the city or on the property.
However, what
That's how it
they
is
said
right
is
now.
correct. If you got angry at the city tomorrow and tore down and cut down every tree on your lot,
Yeah.
there is nothing that would prohibit you from doing that.
That's right.
So why?
Somebody wants to build a house, they go and cut all the trees down and say, oh, there's no trees here, I don't
Well,
have
but I
any
mean,
inventory.
it's true, since
Where's that line?
since we're tree sensitive, I'm saying now is when you wanna be.
So let's back this conversation up for a
Let's
second.
do the
Let's
tree
back it up.
inventory.
So, what, obviously, you're not going to require someone, if they're going to build a single-family home on their lot, they tear it down, they're gonna build a home, to come before you and have to do a tree survey. Under what circumstances, where you are regulating development, either as a subdivision or as a development, that you think is appropriate for them to go through all of the machinations to conserve the trees under this ordinance?
Well, if they're gonna build on their lot, they still see Kevin, so they don't mess up with side setbacks, front and back, any of that. It's not too much for him to educate them on trees.
But the
Okay, if you have
cost-
anything, if it's all scrub brush, there's no deal.
But the cost to inventory every tree
Yeah.
That's
is-
thousands of dollars.
is thousands
Well,
of
that's what I'm
dollars.
saying, you can almost, Kevin's smart enough, or,
Well, if it's,
but you walk the daggone property, you know which ones are big and which ones.
well, if it's
aren't.
if it's in the ordinance saying you have to do an inventory,
Yeah.
then you have to do an inventory.
Which means you gotta
Well,
hire
a company.
You gotta hire a company to do
Yes.
that. And so,
Correct, an arborist at least,
right,
that would have to come in and take a look.
But if it's a single family lot, $1,000, $2,000.
Well, we don't do it, I think a single individual, single family lot is overstepping, but I think when you divide that lot into 3 or more,
Then you got 3 or more single family lots.
then like I said, I guess where is that drawn though? What if somebody has a parcel that they could divide 10 lots and have all the frontage? Should there at some point be, regulation, where is that break point?
Well, I guess if you had, but I mean, and we can get into this next month, I guess, but if you have 10 lots, presumably you'd have to build a street to get to it.
I mean, if they all have frontage, I mean,
If they
there's
all
some
have
parcels-
frontage.
There's some parcels like that.
Yeah.
I don't know, I guess maybe, like I said, that might be my mistake, I may have been misinterpreting, but I was misinterpreting, in my opinion, to the good of the trees. So I'll take that, I'll eat it, if I misinterpreted.
I guess just a general question, is the tree commission weighed in on any of this? That's the only other question I have.
so I have not made any changes other than that one change, so no, they have not waited.
Well, I guess that's the question I had, is do they want to make, does the tree commission advocate to make any changes?
They didn't advocate.
Okay.
I mean, we can certainly have a conversation with the tree commission.
I think it'd be worth providing them the same information, say, do you have comments or suggestions?
Can
I just
you-
want to point out the
Same
comprehensive
size.
plan, one of the goals recommendations is to protect the
I've
tree
always-
canopy. So
I've
it's only
seen,
makes,
heard
it's a goal
the
to
same
set.
arguments, it's gonna cost us $2,000 and the project's multi-thousands, hundreds of thousands, okay, what's 2,000 to them?
Right, I don't
We
think
say,
anyone's discussing.
Do the tree inventory, do due diligence.
Well, it depends on how big your lot is.
Okay.
See,
Well,
we don't,
yeah.
I mean, if you're building a house on a
Yeah.
10-acre lot, you gotta inventory 10 acres. That's tens of thousands of dollars.
Well, no, if they got 10 acres, they're only gonna use an acre to build on, how do you, can you
But-
tell them inventory?
Well,
where you're gonna build?
the way our ordinance is. it's
Well, I'm saying, we
property.
can make it that way. Here's the area you're gonna develop, so inventory that area.
I think there's no
Major
replace,
subdivision makes sense.
yeah, there's no
I mean, if
replacement.
there's no public,
Yeah.
street or utilities involved, then it is just a bunch of single-family lots. If we
Right.
require it for a single-family lot, why would we require it for 10? And, this is Fort Thomas, we don't have any street with 1,000 feet of frontage on it that you're gonna be able to put 10 lots on.
I mean, I think the whole subdivision thing is another topic, like you said.
Right, we'll have the whole conversation about subdivision next month if we get through this.
Well, and the tree, I mean, the places that could be developed are the hillsides, and don't we throw them back into the tree requirements if they've got the 20% slope anyway?
Correct, and that's why there's duplication between those two ordinances, is because if it, we'll throw it back there. Okay, so why don't we, I think your suggestion of weighing in with the tree commission is good. The tree commission is charged under chapter 98 and have their own set of responsibilities there. But keep in mind that as this is currently drafted in your existing ordinance, and I kept it, the tree commission provides you recommendation whenever there's a lot or a site that is subject to these standards. So we will have the tree commission weigh in, and we will potentially table this discussion about whether it should continue to say all subdivision plans or major subdivisions until after we have a conversation about subdivisions next month. How's that?
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay. Section 5.3 adds to the existing landscaping and screening requirements that are currently in the zoning ordinance and makes some changes to your existing lighting regulations. The intent of this section includes mitigating the impacts of incompatible uses and breaking up large expanses of pavement, as well as improving the appearance of parking lots. In terms of the lighting regulations, the intent includes preventing light trespass and glare, as well as recognizing the importance of nighttime usage and the enjoyment of people's property at night. In terms of applicability, all new construction must comply with regulations in the landscaping chapter. In the case of existing sites, for minor changes, the compliance is only required to the extent of the site alterations. For substantial alterations, the entire site must be brought into compliance to the maximum extent possible as determined by the planning commission. And a substantial alteration is defined as increasing the square footage of the building, the parking lot, or the land area subject to development by 33% or more. As with the tree conservation regulations, compliance with Chapter 98 of the General Code of Ordinances is required, and a landscape plan must be submitted. The existing regulations give the planning commission the authority to waive the requirements in this section, and I have added a provision that also gives the planning commission the flexibility regarding the placement and arrangement of required landscape elements. We have added a requirement for landscaping along street frontages that requires 3 deciduous trees for every 100 lineal feet of frontage, as well as 20 shrubs for every 100 feet of frontage. Large deciduous trees are required in setback areas of minimum depth and width of 20 feet, and small deciduous trees are required for smaller setbacks. Large deciduous trees are defined as 2 inches in caliber when they're planted, and small are 1.5 inches.
So I had a question about that. So
Sure.
in the CBD, do we still allow 0 setbacks anywhere?
We do, and you're exempted from this requirement if
Okay.
your setback is 10 feet or less. And I-
That was my question.
In parking lots having 5 or more parking spaces, a continuous 10-foot wide strip of landscaping is required. And in that strip, you have to have either a berm, ornamental fencing, or decorative brick wall, and low-level landscaping that provides a visual screen. The walls and fences have to be a minimum height of 3 feet, measured from the highest finished grade, and a maximum opaqueness of 50%. And the shrubs have to have a minimum height of 30 inches and effectively screen 75% of the parking area.
The only thing I would say about that is, and I think you have it in here, about your site triangle area.
We do.
So that requirement would not be applicable where you have an intersecting driveway.
That is correct. Yeah, site triangle trumps all of this all the time.
The other thing I was just gonna say on the requirement of the 3 deciduous trees on the frontage. So if somebody wanted, this is more of a question, I guess. If somebody wanted to plant them in the right-of-way strip between the sidewalk and the back of curb, if it's in city right-of-way or state right-of-way, do they get credit for that if it's technically not on their property, or it's technically within the right-of-way?
So as this is currently drafted, the answer would be no. I would look to Kevin and Marcus to say whether or not you would ever even want them to plant it in the right
Well,
way.
our tree commission has kind of leaned against planting any additional trees in that tree lawn, primarily because they generally don't do well. They damage sidewalks, create tripping hazards, damage streets, et cetera, et cetera. So we've leaned against that and actually are promoting, when we take down trees, which have to happen in those right-of-ways, we promote our front yard tree planting program, which is kind of a cost share program to plant a tree in the front yard. So we are doing a lot more of that, promoting. I think we're going to be planting several of them this fall through that program. But we generally don't want them in that tree lawn.
I just didn't know if that
As of
was
today.
stated anywhere in the ordinance, that's all.
As it's currently drafted, it all has to be on the private property.
Okay. Because a lot of people don't, I think a lot of, well, I wouldn't say a lot, but a lot of homeowners don't realize that that's not the property.
Right, but this is, again, keep in mind.
New development, I know.
This is only for new development.
Right.
A couple slides back where it said that the planning commission could grant a waiver, did it do it? Is there some binding fact or does it define how or why we would grant that waiver?
In section 1.10, there is a defined section now for waivers that tells you the findings you have to make whenever you grant a waiver. And when we had that discussion, we talked about whether or not y'all should be able to waive everything or just specific items. And the discussion was that everywhere in the ordinance where it's allowed, it specifically states and then references back to that section. So if it's not, we don't specifically state that you have the authority to waive it, then you don't. So keep that in mind as you're reviewing all of this. As currently required, parking lots with 20 or more parking spaces have to provide a minimum of 5% of the interior landscaping. It has to be reasonably distributed throughout the vehicular use area to define major circulation aisles and driving lanes and to provide visual and climatic relief from broad expanses of pavement. And unbroken rows of parking are limited to a maximum of 100 linear feet. Moving on to screening and buffering, whenever development is proposed in a multifamily or mixed-use district, and this development abuts an R1 district, a buffer yard and screening is required. The screening has to be a solid visual screen that is complete within 1 year of planting and be at least 6 feet in height at that time, and the screening has to be in place at the time of occupancy. The minimum width of the buffer yard is 10 feet, and the screening materials can be a combination of evergreen shrubs and trees, or a solid brick wall or fence with landscaping, or an ornamental wall with landscaping or a berm. The planning commission may permit waivers to the buffering and screening requirements when there is existing topography or vegetation that meets the screening objective, or there is innovative landscaping or architectural design, or when there's a required screening will not provide visual screening at maturity due to the topography of the site, or the planning commission is persuaded that the neighboring site will never be developed for single-family homes. Ancillary areas also have to be screened if they are visible from the street or adjacent properties. That includes all trash collection areas, outdoor storage, off-street loading, pipes, conduit, and cables associated with the building or use, outdoor service areas, which includes outdoor freezers and ground level or facade mounted mechanical equipment and utility structures.
So just getting back real quick to the pipes, conduit, and cables.
Yep.
So if you had electric service that's in a commercial building and that's where Duke says they're gonna put the pad mounted transformer, like, are you gonna require them to screen all that?
If they're visual from the street or adjacent properties.
I mean, do we require that now, Kevin?
I don't know that for transformers, I don't know 100%.
Or just when you have the power drop coming down the side of the building, I mean,
It's the power drop that this is specifically dealing with.
that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
We don't require that now, but
I don't think so, but I don't know.
And we don't have to require it now. But sometimes the back of the building with that power drop coming down is quite ugly.
I'm not arguing it's not ugly, I don't know that we haven't done that in the past.
There's nothing that's coming to mind that would have required that.
I would be a little hesitant to do that.
Okay, we'll take it out. All right, are you finding these landscaping and buffering and screening requirements adequate? And any other modifications besides deleting the requirement that the power drops and cords and things be screened? That will be deleted. All right, much of the existing lighting regulations was retained. We did include a prohibition against direct lighting of the sky and abutting parcels. We are prohibiting light trespass, flashing, scrolling, strolling, rotating, and moving lights are also prohibited. Lights have to be extinguished at 11 p.m. except when needed for security purposes or to illuminate walkways and roadways. Sign lighting has to be extinguished at 11 p.m. unless the store is open later. And we've reduced the maximum pole height from 41 feet to 30 feet.
So is that in all the,
Yep, in all zoning districts.
I mean, the only areas I'm thinking about, like down at the Fort Thomas Plaza, I mean, I don't know what their pole heights are now today. Is it more than 30 feet they might be?
Probably. They would just become non-conforming. And if they ever redevelop the parking lot, they would have to be decreased in height.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking too, like, I mean, somebody could argue, like on 27, like the,
Can't hear you.
oh, I'm sorry. Somebody could argue potentially on the pole height of, like roadway lighting along KYTC maintain their street light poles, maybe much taller than that. Maybe, you know.
And I'm sure that the poles are taller than that at the car dealership.
Well, that's what I was about.
Yeah, Fort Thomas Plaza.
Yeah.
So we can either
I didn't know if
make
that
it-
was a specific reason, is that what it says now, 41?
Yeah, it's 41 feet now, which is an odd standard.
Yeah. That's what, okay.
We can do a couple of different things. We can, and generally we've heard complaints, a fair number of complaints about lighting right now, which is one of the other reasons I decreased the height. Also keep in mind that LED lights are brighter, so you can bring the pole height down and still get a fair amount of light spread. So we can either make those poles non-conforming, we can provide exceptions, you know, for example, along US 27. There are a number of things we can do. Does anyone else have any concern about reducing the maximum pole height?
I guess I don't necessarily have a concern, but is there a way the planning commission could also grant a waiver for that if,
Sure.
if a you know, a lighting engineer came in and said, well, this is most efficient, we don't think there's any light transfer off them.
Yeah, I'll put that in. Yeah, easily. All right, any other changes to the lighting regulations?
Do we want to have any lighting regulations requiring LED lighting for exterior commercial lighting? So like high pressure sodium or, I mean, a lot of people complain about sodium lights. That's more of an aesthetic thing and a, you know, energy use thing. I mean, now it's illegal to produce incandescent bulbs. I think our regulations still reference the metal halide and high pressure sodium, I think, in there somewhere.
I deleted some of that stuff.
Okay. And I don't think we said anything about LED, so that's why.
It's not on home, right? Besides the lights.
Well, that's the house that's bad, but
Those LED wouldn't do that. I used to hear the cities walking up here. Could hear, I don't know, the transformer light. I could hear that.
I mean, we can state a preference for LED, we can say all new lighting needs to be LED, unless it's, you know, along the street.
You
or-
can't even buy any other LED light bulb. Those are, they was forcing us to, right?
Well, you can't buy incandescent.
Yeah,
There's
you're
still
the
high
LED.
pressure sodium and metal halide, although they're on the way
I
out.
mean, I don't know what's after LED.
I mean, so the question is, do you have any preference to specify the type of light?
The only thing I would say is, and maybe we need to get some input in this, but we may want to put a maximum color temperature. I don't know if you've seen like over on the Infinity dealer over there on 75 and 4, right there, the purple lights.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the high temperature LEDs. Those are distracting, I think, the purple lights. I think we want to put a maximum
Right,
color
like what,
temperature.
5,500 Kelvin
It's,
to me.
yeah,
I think that's what you buy. Are those even more than that?
yeah, oh yeah, they're like 9.
Oh, wow.
Okay, we can do that.
Yeah, like,
I'm not saying what that number is yet, but I just think maybe we put a maximum.
one way to do it.
I'll put a maximum number in there when we come back in phase 3, we can talk about it.
I mean, that's probably the matter, like there's some type of
Yeah.
maximum.
Couple
All right, any other changes?
My earlier question about, I think really it's about enforcement, not really about the ordinance itself. But just somehow confirming that they meet the requirements that are.
And we do require photometric, which I'm not sure was done.
It was done,
Was
but
it?
I don't think I had it evaluated to confirm that it was correct. So I think
That was
that's
my
probably.
concern, you can put anything on paper, but you don't necessarily get that
Right.
feel.
Yeah, that, but there was one done.
It may be correct.
So was the concern there that it was not illuminated enough, or it was too bright?
Too bright on adjacent properties. I think there's still some, light that's getting through, and it's, woodland is sitting lower.
Right.
And
That's
they're,
what I
they're
thought.
looking into the light. We tried to get some directional lights, we tried to change that, and it's still, reflecting over there. So I'm meeting, actually, I'll be leaving here in about 10 minutes, I'm gonna meet with, somebody to give me some more information and try to zero in. And honestly, I think the amount of light over there through the bollard lights is significant, and I think it's gonna be ultimately I don't think it's gonna be a terribly difficult solution, because there's so much light that comes off the bollard lights that really aren't adversely affecting the adjoining property.
Did we propose, or is there in there now a time limit on when those come off? I see someplace in here, like 11 at night, they're supposed to go off.
So as it's currently drafted, it would have to go off at 11 PM unless needed for security or walkway illumination. So one of the things that Kevin and Mark and I talked about is eliminating all of those exceptions and just say, period, it has to go out at 11 PM. So that's one option. We could say that it has to go out at 11 PM if you have to share a common board or with our district. There are any of those types of things we could do.
What do they do down at the car dealer down there?
They're on all the time.
They're on all the time.
They never go off.
I don't think so.
See, because whether you reduce them to 25%, if you need something out there to walk around there, you reduce them to 25% of what they were.
Yeah, that's
Prior
what
to 11 o'clock.
that was the only thing I was gonna say, is a lot of modern lighting control systems have where they dim at night, and then they have motion sensors that they'll come to full illumination if they detect a vehicle or a person. I mean, that,
Especially if they're LED.
I would, I'd be a little hesitant to say, by God, they all go off at 11, but you could have something in there that they should be dimmed to a certain percent, unless,
What do we do with lights, pole lights in front of Moyer? For me, are way lighter than the auto. Do they go down at 10 o'clock or 11?
Probably not.
And if I lived across the street, I'd be thinking they were.
We don't have any control over that, though, that's a school. We don't have any control over that. That's a
Well, I
school.
know that.
No, they're in the right of way.
I fight the high school, I can read in my
They're
backyard,
in the
the
right of way?
trees are not very,
I remember, honestly, I don't know if they're in the right of way. I know we contributed there. That was wasn't under my purview at the time. I think Ron agreed, we agreed to do certain things
Yeah.
with.
It seems brighter than the ones that are over here by the high school. More of them are brighter.
they're more closely
It
spaced.
seems like there's way more light there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the technology is obviously getting better for LED, and it feels like a brighter light generically.
That's fine.
But it's hard to keep light on property that it's designed to be and not wash over to the neighbor. Almost impossible, I think, because it reflects off the ground, it does something.
No, it's not. It won't reflect off of blacktop.
Well, it'll do some.
All right, so let's gentlemen, at 11 PM, require that motion sensors be installed.
Well, I'm not saying you have to do it, I'm just saying if there is, then I think
Okay.
that.
Okay, if that goes to full illumination, so if somebody's there at 3 in the morning, then the woodland homes light up again?
Well, yeah, usually when that happens, it's only for like 10 minutes or something, if somebody's walking through the parking lot or something. But it's better than being on all night long. That's the intent of it, it's more for security purposes, somebody's walking out there or whatever. You just need to make sure it's not sensitive enough that it'll pick up a raccoon or something.
Here, you go walk
All right.
Would it be can we do an exception to the 11 PM on if you're illuminating an American flag if you have a flagpole, I think if you don't pull your flag down, you're supposed to have it lit the whole time.
True. Or reduce lighting.
Just, you know.
Well, and I think these are are these for any light fixture, I guess?
It says any light
It says
fixture on
any,
on
yeah.
private.
So if you're
property.
like, I'm just thinking like the water tower up at Tower Park, I mean, does that go all the way?
But that's not private property.
No, but the argument is,
Oh, I
It still affects the neighbor.
but I'm just saying more facade lighting, that's what I'm saying.
They already turned that,
You know, put those down, or, I mean, does the tower light go
I
down?
don't think it does.
I think.
They
the
already-
front stays on,
excuse
but
me?
the sides come off.
I don't know.
I live, on Pearson, right there at the tower. They already go off around the side, it's only on in the front at night.
it's-
So, and that helps a lot,
It's
a lot.
reduced.
And I think it's important that we, you know, we require them to down, I think you're definitely right about the flagpole. And let's add something about what happens when the lights are, when you share a common border with an R1 district. Because I'm not sure that we all care too much about the car dealership. I mean, it's ugly, but that's in and of itself.
It's always good to
So, but we would care if the car dealership backed up to someone's home.
Right.
So let's add some R1 language as well. Okay. We'll look at it again with
Like
basic.
the car dealership doesn't go down, just to save electric.
Security.
But it's
Yes.
good every time.
Put in the purple lights.
You wanna light the cars up?
I don't know why they.
Yeah, that's it.
It's happened.
So at this point, we'll take and have community comments on the environmental regulations, the landscaping, screening, and lighting regulations.
So you, I don't know, maybe we're not gonna get to this then, but you had a whole section in there about like, smoke and air quality and all that stuff. Is that separate from what we're talking about tonight?
So that was just the performance standards that were in the journal.
Because a lot of that language is really outdated. And so I don't even know if I can give you some feedback on that separately.
That'd be fine. Yeah, I just didn't have anything, so I pulled something in. All right,
Alicia, will there be, opportunity at the end to address an issue from last month?
that's up to the chair.
And I guess how much longer are we gonna go? If you wanna go longer,
We're at 8:30 now, we have the parking to go through.
I'm good with the parking and then.
But just to go on to the two things we're talking about here, I just wanted to point out, and I think just two of you heard me, but in the comprehensive plan, one of the goals and recommendations is to protect the tree canopy. So when you go back and determine if it's gonna be 3 lots or whatever, just to keep that in mind. And then to talk about, when we're talking about the screening of the electric drop. You know, when we're talking about the buffer being a 6-foot tree, I think that's probably about your height, maybe Frank, 6 feet. So, you know, when we're talking about, when we're talking about, you know, areas such as, woodland, woodland, and I think, you know, I always am using one Highland as our, you know, where you're thinking you only got a 6-foot height, and you might have something ugly like a electric drop coming down, or some of these ugly things that, Elisa was putting screening in for. I wondered how the rest of you felt. I know Dave said he felt like you should not be screening those types of mechanical aspects of the building, but how do the rest of you feel? We're only talking about a 6-foot buffer at the beginning, and those overbodies may never get higher than that, or it's gonna take years and years to get higher. So I just wondered how you all felt about what Elisa had proposed for the screening requirements, whether you thought that was a good or bad idea to keep those in.
I guess it depends on the size and quantity of the material. If it's 5 3/4 inch conduits going up the side of the building, and they're painted out with the building color, I don't see that as being objectionable. If it's a 5-foot wide duct going up the side, then yeah, that would be objectionable. But the way it said pipes and conduit and wires, it seemed like we were kind of overstepping our authority by, you know, it made it sound much more minor than the other things, and that's why I didn't think it was really appropriate.
So Lisa, can you write for that maybe the major aspects would be screened and not the minor aspects?
We can try to come up with something that in some way defines major and minor. We can also just say, you know, pipes, conduits, and cables have to be painted out. We can paint the same colors, the building. But yeah, I'll look at it and see what I can come up with.
You screen it, from a maintenance standpoint, you have the right to knock the screening out.
That's what I was gonna say. So if you have a meter set, well, like a gas meter, electric meter, Duke basically said you cannot block it with landscape.
You could have some nice green stuff that you grew for 10 years, and all of a sudden, it's gone.
Yeah, they can remove it at any time, and if they put a new meter back in there or a regulator, they don't have to paint it either.
Thank you.
They're kind of like the
So, yeah, they don't have to do that.
Yeah, what the language says right now is to the maximum extent feasible, pipes, conduit, and cables should be located along the rear side of buildings if conditions do not allow for them to be enclosed within the building itself. Pipes, conduits, and cables shall be located as far away from public view as practical, and shall be painted a similar color as the building facade to reduce visibility.
I don't think that's.
And that's the existing language. Okay. Moving on to parking. The parking and loading section includes some of the existing parking regulations, but those existing regulations have been augmented and modified as we will discuss. The parking is required whenever there is a new building or use is established, or when the use of an existing building is intensified by adding a floor area or changing the use to a use that requires more parking. For the most part, the parking regulations have been reduced, as you see on this slide and the next one. For example, under the current parking regulation, parking and professional offices have to provide one parking space for every 300 square feet of floor area. As drafted, professional office must provide one parking spaces for 2,000 square feet of floor area. For retail and restaurant uses, required parking has also been reduced. For example, right now, retail stores have to provide one parking space for every 300 square feet of floor area. And as I drafted it, the ratio changes to one parking space for every 400 square feet. And so these are just two very small snippets from that huge table that takes like 5 pages of draft. But generally speaking, all of your standards have been reduced such that less parking will then be required. Any concerns about that? And speaking of Fort Thomas Plaza,
These are all based on square footage and number of occupants, because I know some ordinances talk about the greatest number of people in a shift or something like that, and it's not really anything you can quantify. I mean, they can make it, but the ones we have are square footage and occupancy, which are easy.
for the most part, we do have a few that are based on shifts. I got rid of a lot of those, like all of the existing facilities standards had a lot of those, but there are a few left that do deal with number of employees in the larger shift.
Here's one question, Kevin, down there, actually, for Thomas Plaza, since the church been in there, has there been any parking issue at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
I don't know.
Obviously, the church is only there for a relatively short period of time on, during a given week.
I should know how big of a group actually attends there on the weekend, but if it becomes.
Well, and I think that's just it, though, on that, Sunday morning, a lot of your businesses aren't really
Right.
prevalent, so I'd say that's probably contributing to not having any issue. But no, I've heard.
So for example, Jerry, under the all other industrial facilities category, one space per 2 employees on the largest shift. A lot of the old ordinances would say that you had to have parking for 2 successive shifts, so that you would, and which is just way too much.
Considering the amount of industrial zone we have in the city, it probably won't affect it.
All right, no concerns about reducing parking?
No.
Under the current zoning ordinance, the planning commission may waive or modify the parking requirements in the central business district as well as in the general commercial district. As currently drafted, the waiver would now apply in the central business district and the traditional business district, which is what we're calling for Inverness. If you remember our discussions from last time, Inverness is currently zoned general commercial. The planning commission would not have the authority to waive or modify parking requirements in any other zoning district. The current zoning ordinance is silent regarding the factors that the planning commission should consider when evaluating a waiver. I have added the criteria that you see on the screen, which is in addition to the criteria that is already in chapter 1.10 that we talked about a few minutes ago. In this case, we're asking that the character of the proposed use be evaluated, the availability and accessibility of public parking both on the site and within public lots, And then we are also looking at whether or not parking on adjacent sites have hours of operation that overlap or not, and the impact of providing or foregoing the on-site parking on the character of the central business district and the traditional business district. I have retained the requirement for a parking assessment study, but added additional requirements to the study in terms of what has to be included in it, and required that it have to be done by a traffic consultant, which is not currently the case.
I guess on that question, so how do you define a traffic consultant?
I have not defined it. I intentionally left it vague.
Okay, because I know several parking consultants that are not traffic consultants. So that's why,
Why don't I change parking and or traffic?
or just, I mean, does it have to be a consultant? I mean, if it's a developer, can they, I mean, what is the reason for the consultant, I guess?
The reason for adding a disclaimer as to who has to do it is because I have seen some that have been done by Joe's brother-in-law. And I'm not being facetious when I say that.
Yeah.
I mean, you could just say professional architect, engineer, planner, or
I can
something
do
like
that.
that instead of that way they have somebody on staff or, you know.
And I will change the language accordingly. So Joe's brother-in-law can't do it.
It still could be Joe's
That still could be Joe's brother-in-law, you're right.
Still could be Joe's brother-in-law.
Independent.
The only thing I was gonna say about, and I don't remember how we have it currently in the parking, but, I think it would be beneficial if we had a requirement that if you have a parking lot, that there is a pedestrian way. If the front's on the right of way and there's an existing sidewalk, there's a pedestrian way from the sidewalk through the parking lot to the premises. I mean, you know, you look at like Fifth Third or some of those kind of error buildings where people, you know, you can walk to the building, you gotta walk through the parking lot to the building. There's not necessarily a marked pedestrian way through the building, through the parking lot, I mean. I don't necessarily know that it would have to be basically a dedicated sidewalk, but at least a marked pedestrian path
Yeah.
from the.
To off-site lots.
Well, I'm just saying from the right of way to the entrance of the building. If there's a parking lot out front, yeah, just like a crosswalk.
I mean, to get to Fifth Third, you have to walk either through the grass or through the
The park.
entrance or exit.
Right.
I mean, there's not a pedestrian access.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
So that's a separate issue then in terms of the CBD and the TV in the.
Well, I wouldn't say it had to be in any district.
Yeah, I think that's what you're saying is that needs to be a requirement, period.
Right.
And it is not currently a requirement. So,
There's one at that place that you're showing right there and no one uses it. Just FYI.
well, that does tend, I mean, I have, back in the day, we typically in large parking lots and suburban things required that pedestrian way through large parking lots, and they largely weren't used. But in those cases, we typically said it had to be raised and separate, parking, separate pavement standards and all those other things, and what Dave's saying, it's just.
A safety issue.
Just put in some sort of marked crosswalk, whether or not people choose to use it is their prerogative, but at least provide them with safe access.
Well, the other part is wherever that marked crosswalk is, at least on the stoop or the sidewalk in front of the building, there's an accessible ramp.
Yeah.
It is the building.
I was just gonna say, lends itself to accessibility more, ADA accessible.
Yeah,
I'll put it in.
there's not a US Bank either. There's not a crosswalk.
And some of those sites are just constrained, but if we're gonna redevelop Fort Thomas Plaza, for example.
Right, and like I said, I'm not requiring them to build something just to stripe out a space, just for circulation.
Right.
And that gives some driver awareness too, just to look around and pay attention.
Any concerns about the planning, the waiver for the central business district and the traditional business district?
Is the TBD, those sub-districts we talked about last meeting?
So the TBD is the traditional business district, which is in Furnace. And the CBD would be all the sub-districts for both town center or downtown and Midway would be included.
Yeah, that includes both the CBD and the sub.
Yes, it includes the parent and the sub-districts as well. And that's actually spelled out in the orders that you have the ability to waive it in both situations. So there's no gray area. The zoning ordinance currently has some allowance for shared parking, but the existing table governing the shared parking is really difficult to use. So I added the language that you see on the screen that reduces the number of required spaces by 20% when the hours of operations of the businesses that are doing the shared parking overlap. When the hours of operations don't overlap, the shared parking facility must provide parking for the use which has the greatest parking demand. In addition, the shared parking facility must be owned or leased for at least 20 years. And I retain the requirement that you currently have that users of the joint facility must submit a legal agreement and the guarantee the parking spaces are provided for the life of the use.
So you could use, you have in there a lease or an easement.
Yep. Yep. It can be a lease, it can be an easement, it can be owned.
Okay, I know you said owned and leased, I didn't hear you say.
Yep. That is the exact language from the ordinance, and where it's bolded and underlined, that's new, where it's not, that's your existing language. I also added provisions for off-site parking that require 50% of the required spaces be provided on-site unless it's waived by the planning commission. The off-site spaces have to be within 800 feet measured along the pedestrian route, not as the crow flies. And the off-site lot may be located in a different zoning district, and the lot used for off-site parking has to be owned or leased or an easement for at least 20 years. Any concern about shared off-site parking? All right, any community comments about parking?
If we're done, is it okay to address just an issue that's on?
Did you have anything else?
I don't, I'm done, believe it or not.
Anybody else have any questions?
I have chat.
So just two things. Last month we talked about the central business district, and Sharon and I, we saw in the Brandfield presentation that they did a survey, and one of the top things that came up was that people wanted Fort Thomas to stay away. That we talked about this before. We talked before about how the majority of people in the 2018 survey wanted to preserve the character of Fort Thomas. So to that end, Sharon and I took a tape measure and did the side setbacks on all the buildings on this side of the street. And what's proposed in the proposed ordinance would be this, the side setback would be on one side 3 feet, or a total on 14 feet on the two sides.
No, it's 7 and 4, or 5
So
and
let me
7.
show you this at least and tell me, maybe I'm reading the wrong thing. Or you can tell us what it is, you know better than I do.
Oh, so this is for, what you and I talked about was for the residential sub-district.
Isn't that what the TCS is?
Yeah. The TCS is the supporting district.
Okay, I thought it was the, what is proposed for this area out here that's where the 7 houses are?
If my memory serves me correctly, it is the 7 feet, excuse me, it's 5 feet and 14 feet.
So it would be, the minimum is 5 feet on each side.
No, the minimum is 5 on one side, and a total of both sides has to be 14 feet. So 5 and 9, for example.
So right now, the smallest, most of the separations are like, between the two buildings are like 60 feet, 40 feet, big separations between buildings. But the smallest is between Bowman and David Rollins. That Bowman Framing and David Rollins, and that's 15 feet. So I would just ask when you reconsider it, if you possibly consider the minimum side setback of 7 or 8 feet for those buildings.
And what she's talking about is the homes that are, okay.
And then the next, just very, very briefly, I think it was misinformation or misunderstanding last month when we talked about the historic districts. And this sent me back to Beth Johnson, who is the executive director of Cincinnati Preservation Association. I didn't know it at the time, but she is like the historic preservationist for Cincinnati. And so what I found out, and I gave these out before, I'm going to give each copy again, is the difference between a National Register Historic District and a local historic district. The National Historic Register is an honor, and a local historic district protects. This city decided 21 years ago, so for 21 years we've had historic protections in place for the CBD and for the Midway. What Beth explained to me is that has nothing to do with the individual buildings. The district itself is the resource. And what makes that historically significant to both Fort Thomas and nationally is it's a piece of Americana in two ways. First of all, it's an intact Main Street. And secondly, it shows the development of the commercial aspects of Fort Thomas. So that's why it's a historically protected district. And when we go to the individual buildings and whether there's two analyses. Number one is, are they eligible for federal historic protection? And again, that's just an honor, and you can get tax dollars for it. Last month it was said that the Kentucky Heritage Council is who determines that. What the Kentucky Heritage Council does is help you to nominate your building for the Federal Register. Again, that's just an honor and it might get you tax dollars. It has nothing to do with whether or not we're a local historic district. What it has to do with the local historic district is that we have an ordinance in place, not saying it's a local historic district, another ordinance in place saying we have design review guidelines. Everything in the CBD is subject to the design review guidelines. The next level of analysis, when it gets in front of the design review board, is it now a contributing or a non-contributing building? So that has nothing to do with this federal honor designation. And what that told us was, so for example, there was a lot of talk about the bank being painted white. So first of all, the first level analysis, is that a contributing building or not a contributing building? What would make that a contributing building would be if it was built somewhere between 1890 and 1920. Secondly, she said it might be a building that's a good example of a particular type of architecture, like mid-century modern. So we may have some mid-century modern on this side that are not built in that 100-year-old time frame, but would still be a contributing building. If it's a non-contributing building, the level of analysis is that you don't want to do anything to make it incompatible with the historic district. At that point, the analysis would be, this painting it white, make it incompatible with the rest of the stuff. If we had a historic consultant that we hired on a consulting basis to sit on the design review board, or even with you guys, if you have an issue in front of you, then there wouldn't even be an argument or a discussion. It could just be settled right there and then. If it's a contributing building, then we have a more strict analysis of what we're going to apply from the design review guidelines. The other part that I wanted to just make sure that we drive home is that ordinances are the same. One ordinance is not dependent on the other. So the ordinance that says that this is a protected historic district is not dependent on any zoning ordinance. What we do need, and I know Alicia's proposing in the zoning ordinance, is what's called an overlay district. What that means is base zoning will apply to the whole CBD. All the zoning ordinance, overlay will say it will be a notice to people coming in that there is an additional level of protection in the CBD. So I think that maybe last month, there were some comments about, I asked us specifically with a lot of these comments. One was, would the theater still be contributing even though it's been altered a lot? And she said it's still a contributing building even though it has alterations in it because it meets that historic time frame of, she guessed, 1890 to 1920. One of our, Joe did a survey of all the buildings up here, so she knows the ages, and the vast majority of these buildings in the CBD are from 1890 to 1920 in that area. Those would be contributing buildings, but again, that's analysis not for y'all. That's analysis for the design review board. So there's y'all, there's a design review board. These are two different analyses. So if a project comes to you first, you do zoning, it goes to them, they do that extra level of protection for the design review board. But best news of all, Beth is willing to come and talk to y'all, not for training, just to come, be a resource here, she'll do it pro bono. There are two other independent preservationists in Cincinnati who aren't attached to a city. So Newport has their own, Covington has their own, but she thinks she can get one of these other preservationists to come with her, be a resource for you all some night, when you get through this, or even while you're doing it. If you just have some general questions about what it means that this is a protected historic district, and what that means for zoning, what it means for the design review board, what it means for Fort Thomas in general. So, anyway, thank you for listening, and I've got those handouts again, so that there's less confusion about what is a federally protected district. Again, honors local historic districts protect.
So just real quick,
Yeah.
the determination if it's a contributing or non-contributing building is determined by the Kentucky Heritage Council.
Dave, I asked that specifically, and that is incorrect. The determination of whether or not, so let's say my house is 113 years old.
And in this, and again, this doesn't apply to the design review board. This is in terms of historic significance.
There's two different levels of historic things. So for example, I live in a 113-year-old house. I think somebody important built that house from what I understand the history. So I can go to the Kentucky Heritage Council and they will help me nominate my house. If I nominate my house, I get the designation.
Great.
That's great. Peggy Maggio can put a plaque out. I can tear it down tomorrow.
Correct.
So, because it's not locally protected, it's not in the CBD. So there's just really two different things. So the Kentucky Heritage Council, that told me has nothing to do with our ordinance or our design review boards.
That's correct.
What they apply to. So we're on the same.
That's correct. What I'm saying is though, if somebody would go out and have a survey done and they determine that it is not a contributing structure, you can't prohibit them from demolishing the building under historic grounds if it's not considered a contributing.
It is, well, which you don't want, we're not talking about preventing someone from demolishing the building, but if you're in the CBD, you are under the design review
Right.
guidelines.
It doesn't matter what kind of building it is.
Exactly.
Right.
So we have, and under design review guidelines, there's 4 conditions for demolishing the building. And now again, there's, you know, if it's a building, like you say, then that's a determination, not for y'all, for the design review board, whether or not that building could come down or not come down. You know, it may be, like you say, something they think would be okay, but whatever goes back up has to be within the character of the district. So that's why that's why you have an additional level of protection in our 2 central business districts. You know, I was in Rome in June. When I was in Rome, I went to the Colosseum, I went to the Vatican, I went to the Piazza Navarone, I went to the Pantheon. I went to the airport, and between that downtown, as soon as I got on the city walls, there were tenements, there were high-rises, there were condominiums going all the way out. If that central district of Rome had been protected, that's what Rome would be today. It would be condos, developments, and everything going out to the airport. So that's why we protect those areas that we want to have a piece of Americana, not just for Fort Thomas, because we are a historic city, but for our state, for our country, for all of it. So anyway, thank you for listening. I've got these handouts. I'll give them to you all if you would like.
And just to piggyback on that, the contributing or non-contributing, if it's in that district, and as you just said, it can be torn down tomorrow, there are still things. It has, the certificate of appropriateness must be filed.
So there's 2 things with the certificate of appropriateness. So if it's a certificate of appropriateness, technically, normally that comes under the historic part of it. Now,
No,
you
it
can-
comes under no, not at all. It comes under our design review guidelines.
Yeah, we call it a certificate of appropriateness in our ordinance, but that language is a little nebulous.
That language comes right from the National Park Service. So what
Yeah,
is in
but
our ordinance?
that's what I'm saying. The National Park Service certificate of appropriateness is based on if it's a contributing or non-contributing building.
It's just 2 different analyses. But you know, Dave, I really think that the answer to all these questions could come right from Beth Johnson.
Right,
And
well,
she's willing to come and talk to you
I
all,
agree.
and she'll settle all these issues. Maybe when we talk about the CBD again, so I know this is just a preliminary discussion. CBDs will come back up again when Elisa does the next phase. That might be a time to bring in Beth. You know, she could just sit here, or she could talk to you for less than 5 minutes and explain it. And then if there's a question like this, you know, she's the expert. She
Right. I
can
mean, doesn't really have anything to do with zoning per se.
It really doesn't, because zoning, again, will be based on, now last month we talked about if there is a conflict between the 2. Our ordinance provides if there's a conflict between the zoning and the design review guidelines, the stricter construction wins. So, you know, I mean, that's just the way it goes. That's the way it's written. That's the way it's always been done. And that comes from national language, not just something somebody wrote, you know, one night when they were up. So, but anyway, I just wanted to, since that had kind of come up last month and I saw what I thought maybe some misinformation, it got me back over to Beth Johnson. Sharon went along too, and we had a very nice discussion about Fort Thomas. The Cincinnati Preservation Association would very much be willing to be involved pro bono in what's going on with our rezoning. So while it doesn't directly apply to zoning, to have the sensitivity between the 2 is certainly an important piece to think about. And then they have the overlay so that people know that there's an additional level. All that overlay means is, Elisa's got the language, refer to ordinance number, blah, 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 blah. And then when you buy a house down here, you're on notice that you've got additional protections that apply to your properties.
Right. I mean, I think it would be beneficial for the city to actually have somebody come in and do a survey.
Well, and so that survey would be that would be something completely different, but it is actually in our comprehensive plan. So what that would mean is that would have nothing to do with our local stuff, nothing to do with design review guidelines. That would mean that we would have the honor on our federal register of having that designation for our center, like we do in the Midway. The Midway is on the National Register.
Part of it.
Folks down in the, folks down there that are in that section can get federal funds and state grants to apply to their housing, whereas up here you can't get that. If the city, like in the comprehensive plan, goes down that route, we get on the National Register, which would the Kentucky Heritage Council come in and assist with that, then folks up here would get the same kind of grants. So to me, that would be a win-win. I agree with that.
Did you say that the women's club building?
The women's club is.
on,
They already.
and that's the only one?
In the, right here, yeah. I
In the
mean,
CBD.
well, yeah,
So
the
again,
Midway, part of Midway is.
So they applied for that individual honor that also ties them to some funds, which is.
Highland
what we
United
do.
Methodist Church is also a national, also designated.
It might be.
This one right down here?
The one, yeah, at the plaza.
So that's not the CBD, so I mean, that can be.
Yeah, I know it's not the
$12
CBD,
yeah.
but it's close.
But it's nice that it has that national honor and apply, you know.
I mean, there's several residences within the city.
Absolutely are.
I think last week, or last month, you mentioned it, about the women's club, we were talking CBD. So I was just sort of.
Yeah, I would imagine there's several structures out there that would be eligible for
Oh, sure.
inclusion.
Yeah, but sure, yeah.
We just don't know which ones they are, that's all I'm saying.
And because they didn't do it.
But
anyway.
the Fort Thomas Bellevue Bank and Loan Building probably is not.
No, it's not historical, but it's in the protected.
Right, so
level.
from a design review board standpoint.
So design review board, if they wanted to do something with that, according to Beth, that would be probably a non-contributing building, which means that they can't do something that would be out of character with the district, but potentially they could paint it white. You know, depending on what the analysis is at that time, which is a whole different analysis. than
Yeah,
what we're talking
they would
about.
just have to adhere to whatever the zoning ordinance is or whatever the design review ordinance is.
Exactly. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys. I know you're all tired. And I don't mean to keep beating the same drum, but I will say it in the comprehensive plan over and over again, the historic aspect of Fort Thomas is mentioned both as a goal as well as something that people found important.
Elise, I had a question just about your meetings. You report, people, community members were there and that. Are you getting new insight, new discussions, or is it mostly folks that have been to our meetings? I'm just wondering, so that the comments we get, is that other people, or is that really the same people that are here and able to comment?
Generally speaking, it's many of the people who come here. Occasionally, certain things happen within the community and we'll get new people who come. But generally people speaking, it's the same people.
Just wondering, so if that was new information or repetitive, okay.
Much of what we comment on the next day are based on things we hear tonight that we hadn't heard before.
I'm not, I just want to know who we're getting the comments from, so, I mean.
And I can name people that have only been to one who've come and I'm like, oh, I'm surprised to see you here. And I think every month there's someone new.
Oh, there's could be 3 or 4.
I'm not questioning that. I think it's great that Elisa is willing to do that.
Oh,
I just wondered because all we get is that there are 7 community members there. And I just wondered if that was new information or if that, obviously you can comment tonight, you have, and you will next month, and that's fine.
You're made very clear to us at this directly that a lot of the groups are very hard, are very hard.
So thank you for your.
Yeah, it's really not a joke. I know you all say you're volunteers, so are these people. And they, I will guarantee you put in more hours. I mean,
Thank you for your service.
we care.
Thank you.
It's because we do care.
No, I was gonna say regarding the coffee conversation, thank you for the change in the dates last month. Just
Actually, that
so.
honestly, it worked out really